The liar paradox, there's something strange about today, not because anything's wrong, but because everything feels still. And in that stillness, you can finally hear something that's been speaking all along. A voice. Quiet. Subtle. Almost forgettable. It says just 6 words. This sentence is false. At first, it sounds like nonsense. Like a word puzzle you can brush past. But pause for a second and look closer. If that sentence is telling the truth, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it isn't false, because that's what it says. Your brain catches the loop. There's no way out. Not because you aren't thinking hard enough, but because the sentence breaks the very rules your thoughts rely on. This is the liar paradox. And now, it opens the first door. It's not just a riddle. It's a warning flag in the structure of logic itself, a signal that even the simplest statements can short-circuit your expectations. Because language is supposed to work like this. A sentence is either true or it's false. It can't be both. It can't collapse in on itself. It can't trick you with its own design. But this one does. And once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere. Think of someone who says, "I always lie." If that's true, then they must be lying about always lying. But if they're lying, then maybe they don't always lie. So maybe the sentence is true, and around you go. This isn't just about clever talk. It's about trust. Trust in what words mean. Trust in what people say. Because the liar paradox isn't some rare glitch found only in philosophy books. It shows up in your life. Often. You hear it when a friend swears they're not reliable. You hear it when someone says, "You shouldn't trust anything I say." You see it when public figures say one thing, contradict themselves the next day, and then declare both were honest. And yet we still listen. We still hope to sort truth from lies. That's the trap. The liar paradox doesn't let you escape with a clean answer. It won't let you solve it. It loops, intentionally. And in doing so, it teaches something else. Not everything needs a conclusion. There's value in the tension, in the uncertainty, in admitting that even reason has blind spots. And there's peace in that. Because what if the goal was never to untangle it? What if the point was to slow you down just enough to hear your own thoughts again? What if truth and contradiction can live side by side, and that's not a flaw in your thinking, but a feature of how language stretches beyond rules? So let the sentence repeat. This sentence is false. Let it fade into the air like a question you no longer need to answer. Let it echo for a few seconds more, then drift away. The next paradox waits in silence. Russell's paradox. Let's step deeper now. Not louder, not faster, just deeper. Because the next paradox doesn't twist your words. It twists categories. It challenges the very idea of sets, of collections, of how we group things and how those groups define what belongs and what doesn't. It begins with something that seems innocent. There's a small village. In that village, every man follows a rule. Each man either shaves himself or he gets shaved by the village barber, but never both. Now, that sounds easy enough. It keeps things tidy. You either handle it yourself or you don't. But then someone asks a question. Who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, then, according to the rule, he can't be shaved by the barber. That means he doesn't shave himself. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he must be shaved by the barber, which is himself. And we're back where we started. No matter which path you take, the logic eats its own tail. This is Russell's paradox, and at first, it looks like a quirky joke. But under that joke lies a serious problem. It broke the foundation of mathematics for a generation, because it isn't just about barbers, it's about sets. See, in basic math and logic, a set is a group of things. A basket of apples, a list of prime numbers, a folder of photos on your computer. Some sets include themselves, like the set of all things that are not cats. That set is not a cat, so it includes itself. Others don't, like the set of all teacups. The set itself isn't a teacup, so it's not in the set. But then the question sneaks in quietly, just like it did with the barber. What about the set of all sets that don't contain themselves? If it includes itself, then, by definition, it shouldn't. But if it doesn't include itself, then it should. There's no way out. Just a quiet loop that folds logic in half. This paradox didn't just cause philosophical headaches. It shook the core of early 20th century mathematics. People were building the foundations of math on the assumption that you could list things clearly, logically, without contradiction. Russell's paradox showed that even those clean foundations had cracks, big ones, and suddenly everything felt less stable. But let's step away from math for a moment. Because this idea, this weird loop of self-reference, lives outside numbers too. It lives in identity, in culture, in rules. Think of a rule that says, break all rules. If you follow that rule, then you have to break it. But if you break it, you're following it. Back and forth. Or think about someone who says, I reject all labels, while passionately identifying with being someone who rejects all labels. Or a club that says, no members allowed, and then tries to enforce that rule. Or a person who says, I don't follow anyone, but builds a brand around being unfollowable. Russell's paradox is everywhere, and it reminds us that the boundaries we draw between things, this goes here, that goes there, aren't always clean. Sometimes they fold. Sometimes they undo themselves. Sometimes the person enforcing the rule is the very one it breaks. But there's a quiet lesson inside the contradiction. Be careful how you define things. Not just because definitions can be wrong, but because the rules you build may turn back on you. Not all categories stay in their boxes. Not all roles stay clean. And that's okay, because part of understanding life is knowing when your system stops working, when your categories start looping, when your logic turns back on itself, not because you failed, but because the structure itself was always bent. So today, don't rush to resolve it. Let the barber rest. Let the set remain unsettled. Let the paradox sit in its own shadow, quiet, unresolved, perfect. The contradiction doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to remind you that not everything must fit neatly to be real. And with that, we continue. The next paradox is just a breath away. Thank you for still watching this video. Pause just for a second and subscribe to this channel. Now, let's continue. Berry paradox. Here's a quiet question that hides its teeth. It slips into language through the back door, without shouting, without flashing lights, and by the time you realize what it's doing, your logic is already tangled in it. Let's begin with a simple challenge. What is the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? Seems harmless, right? We're not talking about infinity, just a regular, everyday number. You'd think it's somewhere far down the list. A number so large and awkward that it takes a whole paragraph to describe it. But wait, look again at the phrase itself. The smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words. That's a description, and it took only 13 words, so if that phrase successfully describes such a number, and it does it in less than 20 words, then that number can be described in fewer than 20 words. But if it can be described in fewer than 20 words, then it's not the number we were talking about. But if it's not the number we were talking about, then what was that phrase describing? The loop tightens. You're stuck again. This is the Berry paradox, a quiet, self-destructive contradiction that hides in the way we use words to define things. It doesn't play with truth or logic directly. It plays with language, with description, with naming. And it shows something deep, that even when we think we're being precise, language can break its own rules. You can describe something by saying it can't be described. You can define something by pointing to its indefinability, and in doing that, you break the very structure you were relying on. This paradox doesn't need math to be dangerous, it just needs language. Our most trusted tool. The same tool we use to love, to argue, to explain, to define ourselves. And if that tool can twist itself into a contradiction this easily, then what else in our lives might be less secure than it sounds? Think about how often we use phrases like, "You know who I mean." It's beyond words. She's the type of person you can't describe. And yet, we do describe. We circle the indescribable. We define what's supposed to be undefinable. And sometimes we use those very contradictions to make a point. The Berry paradox lives in those moments. It doesn't just break logic, it challenges the whole idea that naming something gives you power over it. And that touches more than just numbers. In daily life, how often do we try to put things into words that can't quite hold them? How do you describe grief, or peace, or a person you love so deeply? No sentence seems strong enough. Language falls short, not because you're using the wrong words, but because some things can't be boxed in without breaking the box. The Berry paradox reminds us of that. It shows how even a clean-sounding sentence can collapse under its own cleverness. It shows how naming isn't always knowing, and how sometimes the deepest truths come dressed as contradictions. So tonight, let the paradox teach you to loosen your grip. Not on clarity, but on control. Let it remind you that life doesn't always fit the sentences we try to squeeze it into. That not every number, not every emotion, not every truth can be named cleanly, and maybe that's okay. So now we leave this number, the one we tried and failed to describe, exactly where it is. Unspoken, undefined, still out there. The next paradox will meet you where language stops. Grelling Nelson. Paradox. Some things describe themselves and some don't. That sounds simple enough. The word short is short. The word polysyllabic is polysyllabic. The word noun is a noun. These are called autological words, words that describe themselves. Then there are heterological words, words that don't describe themselves, like long, which is a short word, or monosyllabic, which has 5 syllables. They point at something, but not at themselves. Now, here comes the trap. What about the word heterological? Is it heterological? If it is heterological, then it doesn't describe itself, which means it is heterological. That seems fine. But wait, if heterological doesn't describe itself, and that's what it's supposed to do, then isn't it autological? Because not describing itself would mean it fits its own definition. But if it's autological, then it does describe itself, which would mean it isn't heterological. Now we've landed in a loop again. This is the Grelling Nelson paradox, and it's another quiet contradiction that lives right at the edge of language. You're not lost in emotion or math this time. You're simply watching words betray their own labels, and like a hallway full of mirrors, there's no clean way out. You don't need philosophy to see how this plays out in real life. Every day, people use labels to try to make sense of others and themselves. We say things like, "I'm not the kind of person who needs validation," or "I hate people who judge." But those sentences eat themselves alive, don't they? Rejecting labels becomes a label. Saying you're above judgment is a judgment. The more we talk about ourselves in absolutes, the more we risk folding into the very traits we're rejecting. Language, once again, doubles back. And here's the deeper part. This paradox doesn't just expose confusion in vocabulary. It speaks to the limits of self-definition. What happens when a person describes themselves in a way that contradicts their own nature? Think about someone who constantly posts about how humble they are, or someone who passionately argues that they don't care what others think. Are they being honest, or have they just tied themselves into a linguistic knot? The Grelling-Nelson paradox holds up a mirror, not just to language, but to identity. It shows how quickly clarity turns into contradiction when we try to define too tightly. How our own words can unravel under their own weight. And that's not something to fear. It's something to sit with, because this paradox teaches something quiet and true. Not everything needs to be labeled. Some things just are. And the harder you try to squeeze them into definitions, the more they slip through your fingers. So maybe tonight is a good night to let go of the urge to describe everything. Let go of the pressure to always have the right words. Let a few things remain unnamed, undefined, unboxed. Let them be, without needing them to be called anything. Because sometimes peace begins where language ends. The next paradox waits without a label. Curry's paradox. There are statements that twist logic. Then there are ones that melt it down. Curry's paradox doesn't rely on emotion or ambiguity. It doesn't play games with word meanings or hide behind poetry. Number. It goes straight for the engine of logic itself, the if-then structure that underpins almost everything we understand about truth. Let's begin with this simple sentence. If this sentence is true, then unicorns exist. Now, stop and think about that carefully. It sounds silly, maybe even harmless. But it's not. This sentence is built like a trap, because it's structured like a normal logical statement. If this, then that. We use that all the time, in arguments, in programming, in promises, and planning. If I wake up early, then I'll go for a run. If the sky is clear, then we'll see the stars. Cause and effect. Setup and conclusion. Logic 101, but now we apply it to this strange, self-referencing sentence. If this sentence is true, then unicorns exist. The moment you assume the sentence is true, the consequence must follow. That's the rule. So if it's true, then unicorns exist. Fine, but what if unicorns don't exist? Then the consequence is false. And if the consequence is false, then the original sentence must not be true. But wait, if the sentence isn't true, then its own claim doesn't apply, meaning it doesn't require unicorns to exist. So, does that make it true again? No matter which angle you look from, the logic turns into a loop. Now, here's where it gets stranger. You can swap unicorns exist with anything. If this sentence is true, then chocolate is a vegetable. If this sentence is true, then I am the president. If this sentence is true, then gravity doesn't exist. Curry's paradox doesn't care what claim you attach. Once you accept the logical structure, you're stuck accepting the conclusion, even if it's completely absurd. This isn't just theoretical. It means that if the system accepts statements like this, then anything can be proven to be true. Let that sit for a moment. This one paradox, if left unchecked, can make every statement true. even ones that directly contradict each other, even ones that are nonsense. It doesn't just challenge logic, it breaks the entire concept of truth inside logical systems. And that's why it matters. You don't need a math degree to feel how dangerous that is. We build our world on statements like, if this, then that. That's how we navigate decisions, how we reason through problems, how we trust systems, from courtrooms to science labs to friendships. If you care about me, you'll tell the truth. If the evidence matches, then the story is credible. If you work hard, you'll succeed. But Curry's paradox plants a virus right in that structure. It tells us, just because a sentence follows the right shape doesn't mean its logic holds. The shape can deceive. The form can trick you into accepting conclusions that don't follow from reality, but follow from structure. And this isn't just a puzzle you can toss away. It's a real threat in logical systems, especially in formal mathematics, computer science, and even artificial intelligence. Curry's paradox is what happens when a rule is used against itself. It's the logical version of a loophole in a contract that rewrites the contract. It's a quiet sentence that says, if I make sense, then the impossible is real. And unless you shut that sentence down, you're stuck accepting the impossible. But we've seen echoes of this in daily life too. People often construct arguments that rely on this same structure. If I say I'm right, and you agree I'm saying it honestly, then you have to agree I'm right. It shows up in manipulation, in forced conclusions, in systems that allow a premise to define its own consequence without evidence. And the worst part is, it sounds like reasoning. It sounds logical, but it isn't. Curry's paradox reminds us that even logic can be used to undo itself. That the things we trust the most, those clean, orderly sentences that say, if then, can be used to carry in nonsense dressed as truth. So what do we take from it? We learn to be careful, not just with what is said, but with how it's structured. We learn that truth isn't just about correctness. It's about whether the system holding the truth can survive its own rules. And most of all, we learn that certainty isn't always the gift it seems to be. Sometimes certainty is a sentence too perfectly shaped to be questioned, and that's exactly why it should be. Let Curry's paradox speak softly as it fades now. Let its strange promise, the sentence that insists on delivering absurdity, drift into silence. Because just for tonight, there's no need to follow every if to its then. Some sentences aren't built to carry meaning. They're built to show you how meaning can break. And just beyond this crack in reason, another paradox waits. Pinocchio paradox. There's something peculiar about truth when it tries to predict itself. Not in hindsight. Not after the facts are in, but in real time, while the moment is still forming. When truth is still waiting to happen. This paradox doesn't arrive through math or ancient riddles. It doesn't belong to scholars or logicians. It comes from a wooden puppet with a nose that doesn't lie. The character of Pinocchio is built on a simple rule. Whenever he tells a lie, his nose grows. That's it. That's his world. Say something false and you wear it, instantly, physically, a visible consequence. No arguments, no debates, no hiding. Now enter the sentence that breaks the rule. My nose will grow now. It looks harmless. It even sounds honest. But under that sentence is a trap that logic can't untangle. If Pinocchio says, my nose will grow now, and his nose does grow, it means he was telling the truth. But his nose only grows when he lies. So, if it grows, he wasn't lying, and therefore it shouldn't have grown. But if it doesn't grow, then he was lying. which means it should have grown. And now the sentence collapses on itself. It can't be true, but it can't be false either. This is the Pinocchio paradox, a playful contradiction wrapped in the body of a children's story that silently asks a dangerous question. What happens when truth tries to speak for something that hasn't happened yet, but is immediately affected by whether or not it's being told? In most cases, truth is reactive. We tell the truth about things that already are. The sky is blue. She left the house. He never answered. But this sentence pushes forward. It tries to tell the truth about what's about to happen, and in doing that, it influences whether it happens or not. This isn't just a fairy tale puzzle. This structure exists in real life, where outcomes depend on whether a prediction is trusted or not. A weatherman says it will rain, so people stay home. The roads stay clear. Accidents are fewer, and suddenly the outcome changes because of the expectation. Now, was the prediction accurate, or did the belief shape the event? A coach tells the press, "We're going to lose this game." His players hear it. They slump before they begin. They lose. Was he wrong, or did the statement create the failure? The Pinocchio paradox teaches that even the prediction of truth can carry weight heavy enough to distort the truth itself. It's a paradox about self-reference with timing. It traps logic not in a loop of meaning, but in a loop of cause and effect. And it introduces a haunting idea. Sometimes, the very act of describing what's about to happen can stop it, or make it happen when it otherwise wouldn't. You hear this in relationships too. People say, "You're about to leave me, aren't you?" Or, "You're going to break my heart." And in speaking it, they create pressure, tension, doubt, and eventually, distance. Did the statement predict reality, or nudge it into being? The Pinocchio paradox holds a mirror to those moments. Moments where statements are not just reflections, but triggers. It exposes how we sometimes weaponize the future, not through threats, not through plans, but through sentences. Sentences that claim to know what's next, and in doing that, shift the ground beneath what's coming. This paradox also highlights one more thing we don't often talk about: that consequences don't always wait patiently for proof. Sometimes they react to the claim itself. In Pinocchio's world, the nose is a truth detector. But what happens when the detector becomes the thing being described? When cause and effect collapse into each other? That's where the contradiction lies. And just like that, the sentence stops being about a wooden puppet. It becomes about us, about how fragile cause becomes when truth steps too close to its own outcome. About how saying something isn't always just about what's being said, but about when it's being said and who hears it, and how that changes everything. So, let the sentence dissolve now. My nose will grow now. No need to answer it. No need to decide what should have happened. Because this paradox doesn't want a fix, it wants awareness. A quiet recognition that sometimes, even truth misfires when it's spoken too soon. And somewhere, just ahead of that thought, another paradox begins to take shape. Crocodile. Paradox. There's a river, and in the water a crocodile surfaces, cold, still, unreadable. In its jaws a child, no blood, no violence, just a moment, frozen between question and outcome. A parent stands on the bank, pleading. The crocodile listens, then speaks, not with emotion, but with chilling logic. If you correctly guess what I'll do next, I will return your child. This is not a myth, not a story for bedtime. This is a test of reasoning, where mercy depends not on the truth of the guess, but on the structure of it. Now the parent makes a move, not with force, but with words. they say, "You will not return my child." And the paradox locks in. If the crocodile does return the child, the parent's guess is proven false, which breaks the deal. The crocodile only returns the child if the guess is correct. But if the crocodile doesn't return the child, then the guess is true, meaning the child should be returned. No matter what the crocodile does, it violates the condition it just set. This is the crocodile paradox, and it drags us into the shallow water where logic begins to drown. Unlike most paradoxes, this one isn't built on wordplay or riddles. It's constructed entirely on conditional promise. If you guess correctly, then I will do X. And it exposes the instability that forms when you mix power, expectation, and conditional outcomes. The moment the parent says, "You will not return my child," the crocodile is caught. Doing nothing validates the guess, but validating it means the guess is right, which, by its own rules, means the child must be returned. But if the crocodile does return the child, then the guess was wrong, which invalidates the return. The circle closes. And here's where the paradox becomes more than a thought experiment. Because the crocodile isn't the only one who set conditions like this. We've all heard these types of exchanges in real life. A leader says, "I'll take action if the people demand it." Then the people demand it. But the leader says, "You only demanded it because you thought I'd act, not because you meant it." Or a partner promises, "If you truly trust me, you won't need me to prove anything." So when you ask for proof, your trust is questioned. And if you don't ask, you're left in the dark. It happens in negotiations, in politics, in relationships, situations where the conditions are shaped in such a way that no response satisfies them cleanly, where your participation in the process invalidates your ability to receive the outcome. The crocodile paradox isn't just about logic. It's about manipulation dressed as fairness, a condition that seems objective, but bends in ways you can't predict once you step into it. At its core, it reveals the power imbalance between the one who sets the rule and the one forced to play by it. The parent's guess is sincere, desperate, sharp, but the crocodile controls the rule, the outcome, and the interpretation. And that's why this paradox resonates far beyond riverbanks and reptiles. It speaks to those moments in life when reasoning is held hostage. When someone else sets the terms, and no matter what you say, you lose. Think about institutions that claim, "We'll help you if you say the right things." Or systems that claim to be just, but only if you respond in a way they've already calculated around. This paradox reveals a truth we'd rather not face. That some rules aren't meant to be fair. They're meant to look fair while protecting power. Even deeper, it shows how logic can be used to mask emotional cruelty. Because in the end, the parent's guess becomes irrelevant. Whether they were right or wrong, they never stood a chance. Not because they failed to guess, but because the paradox never intended to resolve. And that's the haunting part. This isn't about crocodiles. This is about conditional traps that make people question whether they said the right thing, when the outcome was never really theirs to shape. The paradox doesn't offer a way out. It offers clarity. That when someone builds a system where every answer is wrong, the fault doesn't belong to the one answering. It belongs to the one asking the question, the one writing the rules. So let that realization rest quietly now. The child, the river, the guess, it all fades into stillness. Not because it was solved, but because it was seen for what it truly was. And as the current moves on, the next paradox waits, wordless, but watching. Paradox of the court. There's a kind of silence that hangs in courtrooms. A silence that isn't just about waiting for a verdict. It's about logic squaring off against itself. And sometimes, when the arguments are clever enough, the law no longer knows which side it's on. This paradox begins not with a crime, but with a contract. A teacher agrees to train a student in the art of law. There's no upfront fee. The payment will only be made once the student wins his first case. It's fair, it sounds reasonable. The student learns, the teacher waits, but then the student finishes his training and never takes a case. Not one, not a win, not a loss, just silence. The teacher grows tired of waiting, so he files a lawsuit against his student to make him pay for the lessons anyway. Now, the courtroom fills with tension. Not because of emotion, but because the logic itself begins to break. The teacher argues, "If I win this case, the court says he must pay me. If I lose this case, he will have won. So by our agreement, he must still pay me." Two different outcomes, same conclusion. But the student stands up and says, "If I win this case, then I don't have to pay, because the court said so. And if I lose this case, then I still haven't won any case, so our agreement hasn't been fulfilled. Either way, I owe nothing." Both arguments are airtight until they meet each other. Then they unravel. This is the paradox of the court, and it's built entirely on mutual logic. Each side is correct if you accept their structure. Each uses the contract, the rules, and the condition to support their case. But together, their arguments cancel each other out, and also reinforce each other. They can't both be right, but they also can't both be wrong. This isn't just a theoretical game. This paradox exposes something uncomfortable about legal systems and conditional promises, that when rules are too dependent on future events, the system can collapse under its own delay. The teacher is stuck because the condition, "win a case," was meant to guarantee fairness. But when the student never steps into court, that condition never activates. And yet the student isn't free either, because stepping into court opens a door where either outcome still binds him to pay. It's a loop dressed in robes, a trap made of paperwork and principle. But what gives this paradox its lasting power is how familiar it is, because you've seen it in real life. Contracts with unclear consequences, verbal promises that hinge on someone doing something someday, situations where intentions clash with technicalities. A landlord says, "You'll get your deposit back if nothing's damaged," then defines damage so vaguely that even a scuff on the wall counts. A bonus is promised if performance is exceptional, but no one defines what exceptional means. A deal is struck based on a future event that never comes, and suddenly both parties claim the contract is on their side. The paradox of the court doesn't need to happen inside a courtroom. It happens anywhere trust depends on what might happen next. Anywhere a conditional agreement becomes more powerful than the people who made it. And it forces a difficult realization that sometimes agreements aren't broken by bad intentions. They break because both sides believe they're following the same rule, but are reading it through different lenses. The teacher believes payment is owed because he held up his end. He taught. The student believes nothing is owed because the condition never became real. He didn't win. And both are right, and neither are right at the same time. This paradox is a reminder that contracts without clarity breed confusion. That fairness isn't always found in the lines of a deal, but in how the deal lives out when the future arrives. And it's also a warning. When consequences are left to dangle on hypothetical outcomes, the people involved become hostages to their own logic. So now, let the courtroom fade. No verdict, no gavel, no justice. Just two arguments circling each other like wind with no center. Not resolved, not forgotten, just echoing. Because not every case is meant to be closed. And the next paradox, like the verdict in this one, still waits to be spoken. Hempel's paradox. There's something strange about confirmation. We spend our lives looking for it. Evidence that proves what we already believe. We scan for patterns, we trust our eyes, we lean into what aligns. And yet, this paradox shows just how easy it is to misread proof, even when it feels right in front of you. It starts with the simple claim, "All ravens are black." That statement sounds solid, testable, clear. You can observe ravens. You can look at their feathers. You can track how many match the rule. If every raven you see is black, the statement gains strength. But here comes the twist. Logically, the sentence, "All ravens are black," is the same as saying, "Everything that is not black is not a raven." They are logically equivalent. One states what ravens are, the other what non-black things are not. So, by that logic, if you walk into a room and see a green apple, you've just found something that is not black and also not a raven. And that, bizarrely, should count as evidence that all ravens are black. But that can't be right. Can it? How does spotting a green apple, something completely unrelated to birds, do anything to confirm a statement about ravens? This is Hempel's paradox, also called the raven paradox, and it quietly slices through our trust in how evidence works. It challenges the very core of confirmation. Because if logical equivalence holds, if saying all ravens are black is the same as all non-black things are non-ravens, then every non-black, non-raven object supports the claim. A red car, a white sock, a blue umbrella, each one quietly whispers, "Still no contradiction." But that doesn't feel like proof, it feels like noise. And that discomfort between what logic allows and what intuition expects is where the paradox lives. In daily life, we rely on confirmation constantly. We believe what we see. We collect examples that support our thinking. We build confidence from repeated signals. But Hempel's paradox shows that not all supporting evidence feels equal. When you're testing a theory, not every data point carries the same psychological weight. Seeing 100 black ravens feels like solid evidence. But seeing a banana, or a blue shirt, or a bottle of water, and calling it supportive just because it's not a raven feels absurd. And yet, the logic holds. This paradox teaches a difficult truth. Logic doesn't always feel right, and intuition isn't always trustworthy. They don't always point in the same direction. And when they split, when logic pulls you one way and your gut another, you begin to see how fragile certainty can be. It also reveals how evidence is often treated selectively. We accept what aligns with our expectations. We ignore what seems irrelevant. But if logic says that absence can be evidence, then absence matters more than we think. Think about medicine. A treatment works in 95% of cases. But what about the 5% where it doesn't? Do we call those failures evidence against the treatment, or exceptions that don't count? Think about trust. You might say, "He's never lied to me," but how many of his truths actually confirm his honesty? And how many are just moments where lying wasn't necessary? Confirmation, in reality, is messier than the rules we write for it. Hempel's paradox forces you to pause and ask, when you say something is evidence, what are you really saying? Are you measuring against the claim? Or are you just seeing what you expect to see? And what about all the green apples you're ignoring because they don't fit the narrative? This paradox isn't about birds or colors. It's about how easily the mind draws conclusions from comfort. It's about how dangerous it is to assume that what doesn't contradict you must therefore support you. And here's the deeper weight. You can find 1,000 things that don't prove you wrong, and still not be right, so let that settle now. Not as an answer, but as a discomfort you don't have to resolve. Let the raven fly off. Let the apple stay green. Let the tension between logic and instinct breathe. Because confirmation isn't always what it claims to be, and certainty doesn't always come dressed as a black feather. The next paradox is already taking shape, somewhere between what makes sense and what only seems to. Ship of Theseus. You're told that a ship is docked at a harbor. Its planks are old. Some have rotted, others splintered, worn down by years at sea. So the crew begins to replace them. One board, then another, then more. Eventually, every single part, every mast, every nail, every beam is swapped out. And now, standing before you, is the same ship, or is it? This is the heart of the Ship of Theseus paradox, a question wrapped in wood and identity. If a thing is gradually replaced, piece by piece, at what point does it stop being what it once was? And then, a new layer deepens the puzzle. What if someone had taken all the discarded parts, the original ones, and rebuilt them into a second ship? Which of the two is the real Ship of Theseus now? The one that remained in its place and was slowly remade, or the one that holds all its original parts, just not in the original order? There's no trick here, no clever twist, just a raw question that cuts into how we define identity over time. We tend to believe that something remains itself if the changes are slow, gradual, non-violent. But this paradox forces a confrontation. It reveals how deeply we attach meaning to continuity, even when continuity is just an illusion of memory. And this isn't just a question for ancient ships. It's a question for people. Start with yourself. You've changed. The cells in your body have regenerated. Your bones aren't the same ones you were born with. Your habits, beliefs, routines, many of those have shifted too. So, what part of you stays constant? Is there a core that never moves? Or are we all just versions of ourselves, constantly rebuilt, never fully original, but never completely new? This paradox also lives in our relationships. A friendship begins, it evolves, people grow, they drift, then reconnect. The context changes, the conversations change, and still we say, "This is my best friend, we've known each other forever." But is it still the same friendship if neither of you are who you were back then? In romance, too, we talk about staying committed to the same person for life. But what does that mean when both of you keep changing? Is the commitment to the person as they were, or to whoever they become? And what about the self? If you do something unthinkable, something completely out of character, are you still you? Or has a line been crossed that permanently reshapes your identity? The Ship of Theseus asks quietly, is identity tied to material, or to structure, or to memory, or to something else we can't see but only feel? This question matters even more in a world obsessed with reinvention. We rebrand, we cut ties, we delete old profiles, build new ones. We change names, careers, faces, minds, and often we say, "This is the real me now." But what does real mean when everything is in motion? If you once held strong beliefs but no longer do, are you being truer to yourself now, or were you then? If you left behind everything that once defined you, but feel more whole today, did you lose your identity, or did you find it? The paradox doesn't hand you an answer, because there isn't one. It's not here to accuse or correct. It's here to hold space for the complexity of being something that grows while trying to stay the same. And there's beauty in that, in the tension between change and constancy. in the mystery of recognizing yourself in the mirror, even when nothing looks familiar, in the understanding that identity might not be a thing you hold on to, but a thing you carry forward. The ship of Theseus may never settle its argument. Both ships may claim to be the original, and both may be right, depending on which part of truth you choose to trust. So let the question rest, not as confusion, but as a kind of freedom. The freedom to be rebuilt again and again without needing to explain where the old version of you went. The freedom to change and still say, I am this. Because perhaps the most enduring part of anything isn't what stays the same. It's what finds new ways to hold its form in a changing world. And just beyond that shifting identity, another paradox begins to unfold. So writes, paradox. There's a single grain of sand. It sits alone on a table, barely noticeable. Add another and another. Still, it's not a heap, it's just a few grains. Keep going, handful after handful. At some point, without warning, something changes. You don't know exactly when, but now, you're certain. It's a heap. So, where did the shift happen? When did the pile cross the invisible line between not enough and enough? That's the trap of the Sorite's paradox. It starts innocently. If one grain of sand is not a heap, and adding just one more grain can't possibly create a heap, then adding one grain can never make a difference. By that logic, no number of single additions should ever result in a heap. But clearly, that's not true. We've all seen a pile of sand. So, where's the mistake? The Sorite's paradox is built on vagueness. It targets concepts that don't have sharp boundaries. Words like heap, tall, bald, rich, old, terms we use every day with confidence, until we're asked to define exactly where the cutoff is. How many hairs must you lose to be called bald? How much money does it take to be considered rich? How many minutes late makes someone truly late? These aren't trick questions. They're structural weaknesses in how language maps onto the real world. And this isn't just about words, it's about judgment. The Sorite's paradox shines a light on the quiet shift between acceptable and unacceptable, between what we ignore and what we finally pay attention to. Think about habits. You skip one workout, no big deal. You eat one unhealthy meal, it's fine. But one becomes 2, then 5, then 20. At what point did taking a break become giving up? Or think about ethics. One small lie, harmless, then a few more, each slightly easier than the last. When does it become deceit? When does the character shift? The paradox isn't just playing with sand, it's holding up a mirror to how we let things drift, one small step at a time, without knowing when we've crossed the line. It's what happens when change is too slow to notice but too consistent to stop. You see it in history. No empire collapses in a single day. No movement starts in one headline. It's always a build-up, moment by moment, unnoticed until the weight tips. And because there's no single moment to point at, there's no easy place to say, here, this was the start. But the absence of a line doesn't mean the line doesn't matter. It means we're responsible for noticing gradual shifts, even when they don't scream. This paradox also reveals something else we'd rather avoid, that some of our most confident labels rest on foundations made of fog. We use them anyway, because we have to. But Sorite's shows us how fragile those labels are. And yet, there's beauty in that fragility, because it teaches you to look closer, to notice the buildup, to respect the slow change, to understand that meaning often comes not from a single leap, but from accumulation. 1 grain is nothing. 10 is still modest. But 1,000 becomes something else. And no single grain did it alone. They did it together. one tiny addition at a time. So tonight, the lesson isn't just about logic, it's about awareness. Awareness that the difference between almost and absolutely might not be a leap, it might just be the next step you didn't think would matter. Let the heap remain undefined. Let the grains continue without needing to know when the shift happens. Because sometimes the line never appears. And still, the change is real. The next paradox waits patiently, built not on sand, but on time. Grandfather's Axe Paradox. There's an old axe hanging in a shed, the kind passed down for generations, still sharp, still reliable, still talked about with quiet pride. One day, the wooden handle cracks. It's replaced. Years later, the steel blade rusts and gets replaced too. Now the axe looks the same, it works the same, but not a single original part remains. So the question rises, is it still your grandfather's axe? This is the grandfather's axe paradox, a cousin to the ship of Theseus, but closer, more personal, because this isn't about ships lost at sea. This is about the tools we use, the things we keep, the people we become. It's a test of identity not across centuries but within arm's reach. You can see the handle. You know when you changed it. You remember the day the blade snapped. You replaced it carefully, respectfully. But now that nothing of the original remains, you wonder, what makes it the same axe? We think of identity as something tied to parts, to history, to continuity. But this paradox breaks that open. If an object can lose every single piece and still be called the same thing, then what is that sameness made of? It's not the wood, it's not the metal, it's something else. Something that doesn't wear or rot or splinter. Maybe it's the name. Maybe it's the memory. Or maybe it's the idea you've carried with you that says, this tool, no matter what changes, belongs to someone who once swung it. But let's pull this question closer, because it doesn't stop at axes. It lands quietly at your front door. It walks into your kitchen. It follows you into your bathroom mirror. What about you? Your skin has shed. Your bones have regenerated. Your thoughts, your emotions, your routines, they're not the ones you had 5 years ago. Most of your body isn't what it used to be biologically. Yet, every time you sign your name, you're not writing someone else's. If your habits have changed, if your past regrets no longer haunt you, if the way you love is different now, are you still the same person your childhood self dreamed about? And if not, what part of you remains untouched? The grandfather's axe paradox doesn't just ask about objects. It asks whether anything truly stays the same when all its pieces are replaced. Think about relationships. You say, we've been together for 10 years. But are you really the same two people who met back then? Or are you entirely new people, holding on to the shell of something that once made sense? Or traditions. You celebrate holidays handed down from ancestors. But the food's different. The songs are modern. The rituals have softened. Is it still the tradition? Or just a memory you're honoring with new tools? This paradox stares right into the face of nostalgia. Because part of what we call meaning is built on continuity. We want to believe something is the same because we care about it. We want to believe it hasn't changed, even when we've changed everything about it. But maybe this paradox isn't trying to trick you. Maybe it's revealing a truth we miss. That sameness doesn't always mean original, and identity doesn't need untouched parts to be real. Maybe what holds something together isn't what it's made of, but what it's meant to us all along. The axe is still your grandfather's not because the handle and blade remain, but because you still call it his. Because you still think of him when you see it. Because something unspoken survived all the changes. And in that way, maybe you're still you too. Not because your pieces haven't changed, but because something deeper kept moving forward, quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. Let the paradox rest now. Not with certainty, but with acceptance. The axe may not be what it was, but perhaps it's never been more itself. And just beyond the shed door, another paradox waits, not in tools, but in time. Omnipotence paradox. It starts with a question that doesn't look like a trap. But it is, because once it enters your mind, it doesn't let you leave the same way you came in. Can an all-powerful being create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then there's something the being cannot do, lift the rock. If the answer is no, then it cannot create the rock. Either way, it hits a limit. And a being with limits is by definition not all-powerful. This is the omnipotence paradox, a quiet collision between language, power, and the boundaries of what it means to be limitless. It forces a contradiction into a definition that was supposed to be perfect. It twists power against itself until it breaks, not by weakness, but by overreach. We're told growing up that all-powerful means no restrictions, no ceiling, no edge, no end. But this paradox shows that even the concept of unlimited power might be hiding its own flaws. Because here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Some definitions can't hold the weight we place on them. The problem with omnipotence isn't about what it can do. It's about whether absolute power can exist without collapsing under its own expectations. Can perfection include the ability to contradict itself? Can limitlessness include the power to self-limit? Can a being truly be called all-powerful if there's even one logically impossible task it cannot perform? But this isn't just a question for theology or metaphysics. It reaches into how we think about control, authority, even freedom. Because every person, at some point, has wanted to feel limitless. We say things like, if I had the power, I would fix everything. If I could do anything, I'd never feel pain again. If I ran the world, no one would suffer. But the paradox lives here too. Because complete power doesn't guarantee complete peace. It guarantees contradiction. Every choice creates its opposite. Every action removes the freedom to choose otherwise. If you fix everything, what happens to struggle, to growth, to meaning? If you remove pain, what happens to empathy? If no one suffers, what happens to the learning that comes from loss? The omnipotence paradox shows that even perfection has tension built into it. It's easy to think of power as an endless ladder, but once you reach the top, the ladder starts to bend. And now you're holding something too big to control. You've seen this reflected in leaders, those who try to control everything, only to realize they must restrict themselves to preserve their authority. You've seen it in parenting, in politics, in institutions that start out promising protection and end up becoming cages. True power often requires self-restraint, but the moment power needs to restrain itself, it ceases to be total. And that's the heart of this paradox. Unlimited power, to remain stable, must voluntarily choose limits. But if it can limit itself, then there's something it cannot do. Be both boundless and bound. And so the cycle begins again. Some argue that the paradox is just linguistic, that the question is flawed, that asking about a rock that can't be lifted is no different from asking if a square can be a circle. But language isn't the enemy here. The contradiction doesn't come from grammar, it comes from expectation. From the human need to believe that perfection must include every possibility, even the impossible ones. And that desire is what exposes the limits, not of divinity, but of thought. We want power without consequence, freedom without friction, control without compromise. But the paradox teaches that every power, taken far enough, begins to cancel itself out. That absolute control means losing the freedom to be vulnerable. That absolute strength means surrendering the right to fail. That absolute choice may one day eliminate the ability to choose at all. So maybe the question isn't whether an all-powerful being can lift the rock. Maybe the real question is, why would it need to prove it in the first place? Let that question settle. Not for an answer, but for what it reveals. Because sometimes the deepest paradoxes don't ask you to solve them. They ask you to rethink what you believe deserves to be solved. And with that, power steps aside. The next paradox doesn't challenge strength, it challenges time. Paradox of the stone. Power only looks clean from a distance. Up close, it has corners, sharp ones. And if you press too hard, it cuts the very hands that hold it. The paradox of the stone begins with a question that doesn't beg for an answer. It begs for a collapse. Can a being with unlimited power create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it? At first, it feels like an echo of the omnipotence puzzle. But this isn't about gods or God's rules. This is about the boundaries of what it means to hold infinite capacity, and whether that idea makes sense at all when it tries to fold back into itself. The sentence folds quietly. If the answer is yes dash dash, if such a being can create a stone too heavy to lift, then there exists a task it cannot perform. It cannot lift the stone. That's a limit, and limitless power isn't supposed to have any. But if the answer is no, if it cannot create a stone it cannot lift, then there's already something it cannot do, still a limit. The paradox locks. It's tempting to say the question is broken, that it's just wordplay or a trick of definitions, but the more you sit with it, the more it speaks to something deeper. Not about stones, but about contradictions that sneak into logic when you carry any concept to its extreme. Because this isn't a riddle about rocks, it's a spotlight on the instability of total freedom. The idea of absolute power collapses, not because it's small, but because it's too big to contain itself. Any power that claims to be all-encompassing must also be able to restrict itself. But to restrict is to limit, and to limit is to fall short of being all-powerful. So now, power starts to unravel, not in war or rebellion, but in syntax. The paradox of the stone makes one thing clear. The strongest force in the universe, real or imagined, might not be undone by something greater. It might be undone by the structure of its own promises. When you say, "I can do everything," you open the door to the kind of question that no system can hold. You invite a challenge that isn't a threat. It's a test of consistency. And consistency is where so many ideas fall apart. We love to believe in absolutes. Absolute justice, absolute freedom, absolute knowledge. But every absolute eventually stumbles into this paradox. A justice so absolute that it leaves no room for mercy. A freedom so complete that it eats itself alive. A knowledge so total that it becomes impossible to question, because questioning would admit a gap. The stone is just a metaphor. It can be replaced with anything that represents the breaking point of totality. A lock with no key. A flame that can't be extinguished. A truth so final it can no longer evolve. The paradox becomes even more interesting when you stop talking about divine beings and start talking about yourself. You say you're capable of anything. You say nothing can stop you. You say limits are illusions. But then life asks you a quieter question. Can you build something inside yourself that you no longer control? A commitment you can't walk away from? A belief so foundational that it cages your ability to think differently? A promise that becomes heavier than you expected? And when that happens, when your own creation becomes too heavy for you, what does that say about your power? Was it ever real, or was it just the idea of control dressed up as truth? The paradox of the stone reminds us that power has two faces, one that acts and one that must face the weight of its own actions. Because real power isn't just about what can be done, it's about what cannot be undone. And once a burden is created, whether it's a memory, a belief, a responsibility, or a relationship, there may come a day when even the hand that made it can no longer lift it. So let the stone remain unlifted, not as a failure of strength, but as a lesson about boundaries we don't like to admit exist. The next paradox doesn't challenge what we can carry. It challenges whether we know who we are at all. The problem of the heap. There's a truth we all hold on to without even thinking about it, that some things just are what they are. A pile is a pile, a crowd is a crowd, a beard is a beard. But then the paradox comes in, not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet question that slowly eats away at certainty. How many grains of sand make a heap? Start with one. Clearly not a heap. Add a second. Still no. Third, fourth, fifth. Tiny changes, almost invisible. No one in the world would stop and say, now that's a heap. But keep going. 20, 50, 100. Eventually, someone says yes. That's it. That's the threshold. And yet, which grain was the one? Which addition transformed scattered dust into a defined form? Where did nothingness become something? This is the problem of the heap, an alternative lens through the well-known Sorite's paradox, but stripped of abstraction. This one is grittier, earthier, and much closer to home. Because it isn't just about grains of sand, it's about categories, about how we group and label things without ever truly knowing where the line is, yet trusting the line is there. The discomfort of this paradox doesn't come from not knowing the answer. It comes from discovering there is no answer. The boundary isn't real. We act like it is. We build entire systems on it. But when pressed to point to the exact spot where change happens, the line vanishes. And this illusion of a clear line runs deep into the human experience. Take age. At what point does a child become an adult? Is it 13, 16, 18, 21? You pick a number and society nods. But what about the day before or the day after? What changed? The body doesn't transform overnight. The brain doesn't finish its rewiring on a birthday. Still, we assign rights, responsibilities, and consequences based on a cutoff that doesn't actually mark anything concrete. Or look at poverty. What defines someone as poor? A few dollars below a statistical line, and a person is struggling. A few above it, and somehow they're stable? Reality doesn't move in those sharp increments. But policy does, and so people fall through cracks that were never supposed to be there in the first place. This is the deeper pain behind the problem of the heap. We crave precision in a world that rarely offers it. We force language to draw boundaries around things that shift constantly. Bald, tall, happy, addicted, successful, beautiful. All of them exist on sliding scales, but we speak of them as if they arrive in a single step. As if the presence or absence of one more unit tips the scale from not enough to complete. And worse, we use these vague labels to judge people. We say someone isn't trying hard enough. We say someone has too much. We say someone's feelings don't count because they're not suffering enough. But enough was never defined. It was just implied. The paradox doesn't just expose confusion in categories. It exposes how we use those categories to justify behavior, to make decisions, to draw moral lines. As if the math has been worked out when really we're just guessing. And maybe this is why the problem of the heap is so unsettling. It doesn't ask you to solve it. It asks you to notice how often you pretend it's been solved already. It whispers through every spreadsheet, every policy, every conversation that depends on quantifying something too complex to be reduced. And yet, paradoxically, we need categories. We can't function without them, but we also can't pretend they're more solid than they are. So maybe the lesson isn't to abandon the labels, it's to approach them with humility, to recognize that most of what we call firm ground is just a temporary structure built on shifting sand. Let the heap stay undefined. Let the next grain fall without a name. Because maybe truth doesn't live in the number. Maybe it lives in the space between grains, where silence says more than precision ever could. And just beyond this crumbling line, another paradox rises. This time, not about piles or thresholds, but about the person standing between two futures, unable to move. The bootstrap paradox. There's a watch ticking on a table. Its surface is flawless. No scratches, no fingerprints. It works perfectly. And beside it, a note. This watch was never built. It was passed along. Now pause. Where did it come from? If no one made it, if it was just handed from person to person, century to century, then what's its origin? Who designed it? Who crafted it? What made it real? This is the bootstrap paradox, one of the most unnerving puzzles hidden inside the fabric of time travel. It starts with an object, or an idea, or a piece of information. It gets passed backward in time, and eventually someone in the past discovers it, preserves it, and sends it forward again. The loop closes. The object has no origin. The idea has no author. The song has no composer. The machine has no inventor. It exists because it existed. The paradox gets its name from an old phrase, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Something that sounds noble, but is physically impossible. You can't lift yourself into the air by tugging on your own boots, just like you can't create a loop with no start point. And yet, here we are. In stories, the bootstrap paradox is everywhere. A time traveler reads a novel, goes back in time, hands the manuscript to a young author, who publishes it as their own. And now the traveler grows up reading that same novel. Who wrote it? No one. Or maybe everyone? But this isn't just a sci-fi trick. It's a thought experiment that breaks down the very idea of cause and effect. It asks a question so simple it's dangerous. Does every origin need a beginning? We're used to thinking in chains. This led to that. That led to this. Time moves like dominoes. Linear, clean, traceable. But the bootstrap paradox cuts the first domino out entirely. Now the sequence stands on its own, unsupported, suspended in causality with no source. And here's where it gets personal, because you've seen echoes of this paradox in the real world. Not through time machines, but through culture, influence, and memory. A phrase spreads online, shareable, quotable, oddly familiar. It appears everywhere. People attribute it to Einstein, to Mandela, to ancient wisdom, but no one can find the original source. So where did it start? Sometimes it didn't. It simply existed because it was repeated. Or think about family stories. A ritual passed from parent to child, one generation to the next. You ask where it came from, and no one knows. We've always done it this way. That's the loop. That's the paradox hiding in plain sight. Even in your thoughts, this pattern lives. A belief you've always held, a feeling that shaped your choices. But when asked where it came from, there's no clear memory, no beginning, just an idea that seems to have always been waiting for you. The bootstrap paradox isn't about machines or physics. It's about how fragile our sense of origin really is. We rely on beginnings to define truth. We want to trace things back to the first artist, the first scientist, the first invention, the first word. Because if we can find the start, we think we can understand the meaning. But this paradox says, maybe not. Maybe some things loop. Maybe not all knowledge is born. Maybe it simply arrives, and because we accept it, it stays. But there's another layer. Because the paradox doesn't just ask, where did this come from? It also whispers, does it matter? If the object functions, if the idea is useful, if the watch keeps perfect time, do we need to know who made it? Maybe the value of something doesn't live in its beginning. Maybe it lives in its survival. The bootstrap paradox unsettles because it leaves you without a foothold. No anchor, no clear path, just a circle that feeds itself endlessly without asking permission. And in that circle is a kind of quiet, not of confusion, but of release. Release from the need to explain everything. Release from the pressure of origin stories. Release from the demand that meaning must come from a start. Let the loop stay closed. Let the watch keep ticking. Let the story go unwritten by the one who never wrote it. And as time folds inward on itself, the next paradox waits, not in clocks, but in decisions, frozen between options, unmoving by logic, and fully, painfully aware. Paradox of inquiry. There's a question that stops thought in its tracks, not because it's complicated, but because it looks so ordinary. No one notices the edge it hides. How do you look for something when you don't know what it is? If you already know what you're searching for, then discovery is just confirmation. If you don't know at all, how will you even recognize it when you find it? And if you can't recognize it, how can you say it was ever the answer? This is the paradox of inquiry, sometimes called Menno's paradox, drawn from a quiet passage in one of Plato's dialogues. And it asks a devastating question, one that makes you rethink the very act of learning. It works like this. If you know something, inquiry is pointless. If you don't know what you're looking for, inquiry is impossible. So, why do we ask questions? What's the point of searching if the only outcomes are either discovering what you already knew or failing to know when you've discovered something new? At first glance, the paradox seems clever but hollow, just semantics, a trick of phrasing. But then you feel it settle in deeper. Because this paradox reveals a silent flaw in human understanding. We often think we're exploring the unknown, but most of the time we're just circling around fragments of the familiar, hoping they point to something we haven't seen yet. And that's the uncomfortable part, the illusion that inquiry is always progress, that asking the right question guarantees movement. But what if the real obstacle isn't about finding the answer? It's about knowing what counts as an answer to begin with. When a child asks what love is, and you say it's trust, or safety, or effort, have they found the answer, or just another layer of the question? When a scientist builds a theory to explain a phenomenon, and the data lines up, did they discover something new, or build a model that reflects their own expectations? When a person searches for meaning, finds a belief, adopts it, and clings to it, have they solved their hunger for truth, or just paused it. The paradox of inquiry warns that discovery can be circular, that we might ask questions that only lead us back to the same mental territory. Not because we aren't curious, but because we don't know how to escape the orbit of our assumptions. And here's the deeper tension. To seek something you cannot define means you must be willing to stand in ignorance. Not momentarily, but indefinitely. It means you must open your mind to the possibility that what you're looking for has no shape you can recognize yet. And that kind of search is hard. It requires patience without direction, humility without surrender. It's why most people prefer tidy answers. Categories, labels, packages of meaning they can hold in their hands and say, "This is it." But the paradox holds a mirror to those answers and asks, how do you know you're done searching? Because often, the moment we label something as understood, we stop looking. We stop stretching the limits of what we thought we knew, and in doing so, we close the door too early. Inquiry then becomes a kind of bravery, not because it always leads to clarity, but because it refuses to accept the comfort of not knowing as an excuse to stop. And maybe this is the quiet truth behind the paradox, that the most powerful form of knowledge isn't the answer. It's the kind of question that forces you to stay uncomfortable, to keep going, to keep doubting, to keep peeling back layers of assumptions you didn't know you had. So, how do you search for what you don't know? You start, even if you're unsure, even if the path makes no promises, even if what you find looks nothing like what you thought you were after. You start anyway, because sometimes the act of questioning isn't about finding a conclusion. It's about becoming the kind of mind that refuses to settle. Let that uncertainty be enough for now. Let the paradox hold, not because it's solved, but because it made you pause. And just beyond the edge of this question, another paradox waits. Not about learning, but about motion itself, and why taking a step forward might never reach the finish. Theseus's memory. Paradox. There's a question that doesn't arrive with noise. It slips in during the quiet moments, when the rush has settled, when the voice in your head gets a little softer. If your memories were erased, would you still be the same person? The paradox begins where identity meets continuity. It asks not what you've done, not what you've said, but what you remember, and whether that thread of memory is the only thing holding yourself together. This is the Theseus memory paradox, drawn from the ancient problem of the ship whose parts were replaced one by one, but shifted now, not toward boats or bodies, but toward the mind. The human brain rewrites itself constantly. Old connections fade, new ones form. You forget birthdays, addresses, old passwords, old pains. You no longer remember the sound of your first school bell, or what your favorite shirt smelled like when you were 12. And yet, you say with confidence, "That was me." But what if all those memories were gone? Not repressed, not ignored, gone. If your mind woke up tomorrow with no record of your name, your hometown, your mistakes, your childhood fears, would the you that remains be anyone in particular? Would it be enough? This paradox doesn't deal in fantasy. It walks alongside real things: amnesia, trauma, neurodegenerative illness, age. You've seen it in people who no longer recognize their family, who don't recall their own children, who look in the mirror and feel only confusion. They eat, they breathe, they feel. But are they still themselves? And how would you even begin to answer that? Because what this paradox challenges is our quiet assumption that identity is built on something solid. We believe we are a self, something continuous, stable, trustworthy. We speak of personal growth as if it's a straight road from past to future. But memory is the pavement beneath our feet. When it crumbles, what holds us up? Some argue that identity lives in personality, habits, preferences, reflexes, but those change too. Over time, tastes evolve, opinions shift, reactions soften, and none of it happens at once. It happens slowly, invisibly, until one day you look back and realize you barely resemble who you once were. So where does the self end? If every memory can be lost, if every belief can change, if every part of your mind can be restructured, then who is left when the rewiring is done? Maybe the question isn't whether you remain yourself, but whether yourself was ever a fixed point to begin with. This paradox opens a door into something rarely spoken about: the fear that the self is fragile. That identity might be a flickering projection, sustained only as long as memory keeps the reel running. And yet, there's a strange kind of freedom in this. Because if memory defines the self, then the past isn't a prison. It's a scaffold, one that can be rebuilt. If you forget something painful, does that pain still shape who you are? If you let go of a mistake you made, can that version of you fade with it? The Theseus's memory paradox doesn't just provoke doubt, it quietly opens a possibility. That change isn't betrayal, that forgetting isn't failure, that losing part of your past doesn't mean you've lost your worth. Because maybe the self isn't a single thread. Maybe it's a pattern, a rhythm, a way of moving through the world that keeps evolving, even when the pieces shift. The question remains, unclosed, because it must. If a person wakes up tomorrow with no memory of who they've been and still chooses kindness, curiosity, honesty, what exactly have they lost? Let the question remain suspended, not for fear of forgetting, but for the quiet reminder that identity may not need to be remembered to be real. And beyond this fracture in memory, another paradox waits. One not of who we are, but how time itself may trap us in a loop we cannot exit. Grandfather paradox. Step into the past, not in theory, not as an idea, but physically. Step through it, a machine, a doorway, a moment. You travel backward. You arrive before your own story begins, before your first memory, before your birth. You are now standing in a world where your existence has not yet begun, and you're holding a decision that could end it before it ever does. That's the door to the grandfather paradox, one of the oldest and most disorienting puzzles ever tied to time. It goes like this. You go back in time. You meet your grandfather before he ever has children, and for whatever reason, by accident, by conflict, by choice, you prevent him from having your parent. Now, your parent was never born, and neither are you, but if you were never born, then how did you travel back in time to begin with? If you didn't exist, you couldn't have done anything, which means your grandfather survives, which means your parent was born, which means you were born, and once again, you go back. And the cycle begins again. It's not just a contradiction, it's a loop that refuses to settle. An event that undoes itself the moment it happens. This paradox shatters the straight line of cause and effect. We're used to time moving forward. One event leads to another. One action creates the next. But here, the line folds inward, becomes circular, eating itself over and over again. It asks something most time paradoxes avoid. What if changing the past breaks the present that allowed you to change it? And it goes deeper than that, because this paradox isn't just about time travel. It's about causality, about whether the future can ever touch the past without unraveling both. It challenges the idea of consistency, that history is fixed, that events unfold from beginning to end like chapters in a book. But the grandfather paradox throws the book into the fire and then asks, was it ever written at all? And you feel this paradox in more places than science fiction. Think about people who've made decisions they thought would fix everything, only to realize that their attempt to correct the past unraveled the very things that gave them meaning. Someone walks away from a toxic family, cuts ties to stop generational pain, only to feel haunted by the very absence they created. They erase the link, only to wonder who they are without it. Or someone revisits an old love, thinking they can change how it ended. But in doing so, they change who they've become. The grandfather paradox is a mirror. It asks, if you could rewrite the moment that made you who you are, would you still be you? And if the answer is no, then changing the past doesn't just rewrite history, it rewrites the present, which means the person making the change would no longer exist to make it. And the paradox loops again. Some theories try to fix this with timelines. They say multiple worlds, alternate branches. You don't undo your own existence, you just create a version where you never were. Another reality, another you. But even that doesn't break the paradox, because now you've created a version of reality where your actions, your very presence, are based on events that can no longer support your presence. The foundation cracks, and still the loop spins. It's a trap that's beautifully cruel. You only gain the power to change things once the thing you want to change has shaped you into the person who would try. But the moment you succeed, you delete the version of you that tried. So the paradox stays unresolved, not because we lack imagination, but because time, as we know it, can't stretch in both directions at once without tearing apart what we rely on most: continuity. It leaves you with a question that won't let go. Is the past untouchable not because it can't be reached, but because it holds the very keys to your being? Let that question settle. Let it stay unfinished. Not every loop is meant to close. The next paradox doesn't pull you backward. It holds you in place, frozen between two options, equally rational and equally paralyzing. Predestination. Paradox. There's a story that unfolds in reverse. You think it begins with a decision, but it doesn't. It begins with the consequences. And by the time you arrive at the moment of choice, everything is already in motion. This is the heart of the predestination paradox, a time loop where cause and effect aren't just tangled, they're the same. You travel back to prevent something: a war, a betrayal, a tragedy. You act, you interfere, you disrupt what was meant to happen. But when the dust clears, you realize something devastating. Your attempt to change the future is the very reason it happened. It's not the kind of paradox that spins endlessly. This one snaps shut like a bear trap. The harder you fight to rewrite the timeline, the more tightly it pulls you back into it. Your actions, rather than redirecting history, fulfill it. And what makes this paradox uniquely cruel is that you don't know it's a trap until it's too late. You think you're breaking a cycle, but you're completing one. This isn't science fiction anymore. It's philosophy wrapped in narrative. It's the question of free will turned inside out. Because if every action you take in the past is already part of the future you're trying to escape, then did you ever have a choice? Were you sent back because you decided to act, or because you were always going to act? You feel this paradox not in theory, but in memory. Think about the moments in your life where you tried to avoid something, and in doing so, you steered directly into it. You don't want to be like your father, so you do the opposite of everything he did, only to become a mirror image in a different costume. You try to protect someone from a mistake you made. And in your effort to shelter them, you plant the exact seed that leads them down that path. You walk away from something you believe will break you. But that departure is what unravels everything you were trying to preserve. The predestination paradox is real. Not just in loops of time, but in loops of behavior, of intention, of history repeating itself while wearing a different face. And it asks a terrifying question. Are we truly making decisions, or just reenacting outcomes that have already been written? When people say, "It was meant to happen," or "You were always going to end up here," this is the paradox they're leaning into, whether they realize it or not. But the danger of the predestination paradox is this. Once you believe your choices don't matter, you stop making them with any real courage. You surrender to the story as if the ending can't change. And yet, paradoxically, the moment you choose not to fight fate, you fulfill it again. So, maybe the answer isn't to stop acting. Maybe the answer is to act with awareness that some outcomes will resist change. Not because change is impossible, but because some consequences are tied to our most honest intentions. You try to save someone because you love them, and in trying to save them, you push them away. But the love was real, the motive was clean, and that still matters. The paradox doesn't mean you are powerless, it means the path is curved, that the road back and the road forward might be the same one. But you can still walk it with your eyes open. Let the loop close softly now. Let the outcome arrive not as punishment, but as reflection. Not all circles are cages. Some are mirrors, and just beyond the turn of this curve, another paradox waits. Not about fate, but about the possibility of knowing anything for certain. Newcomb's paradox. You walk into a room. In front of you sit two boxes. One is transparent. You can see it holds $1,000. The other is opaque, sealed shut, its contents unknown. You're told the rules. You may take only the opaque box, or you may take both boxes. But here's the twist. Before you walked in, a highly advanced predictor, known for nearly perfect accuracy, already made a prediction about what choice you would make. If the predictor foresaw that you would take only the opaque box, then it placed $1 million inside it. If the predictor foresaw that you would take both boxes, then it left the opaque one empty. And now the boxes sit before you, unchanged, waiting. You must choose, take both, and you're guaranteed $1,000, and maybe nothing more. Take one, and you might walk away with $1 million, or with nothing at all. This is Newcomb's paradox, and it doesn't test your logic. It tests your belief in free will. The problem breaks you in two, between what you know and what you believe. If the prediction has already been made, and the money is already in the box, or not, then your decision can't change anything now. So you might as well take both. Get the guaranteed $1,000, that's the dominant strategy. But if the predictor is truly accurate, and it predicted your action before you even stepped in, then the only way to get the $1 million is to take just the one box, because taking both would have already been anticipated, and the $1 million would never have been placed there to begin with. So now you stand at a crossroads where decision influences prediction, and yet prediction came before decision. It violates everything we understand about cause and effect. And deeper still, it challenges the meaning of choice. Are you choosing freely in this moment, or are you simply playing out a script that's already been written, read, and acted upon by a predictor who knows you better than you know yourself? The paradox brings together two visions of the world. One where the future is open, uncertain, shaped by your current actions, and one where the future is locked, already set, merely waiting for you to discover the outcome. And you feel the weight of this paradox in the real world. Every time you try to change a habit, and your own predictability fights back. Every time you feel watched by data, algorithms, trackers, and begin to act differently because of it. Every time someone says, "I knew you'd do that," and you wonder whether they caused your action or just anticipated it. Newcomb's paradox exists in how we model trust. Do you trust the predictor enough to believe that your current choice is already accounted for? Or do you trust your own autonomy and act in spite of the odds? It also lives in economics, psychology, artificial intelligence, where systems are built to guess what you will do before you've done it. And often they're right. But if they're right often enough, do your choices become any less your own? That's the unease at the core of this paradox, because it whispers that perhaps you're not choosing at all. Perhaps you're just confirming a forecast, playing out a possibility that was always going to be. And still, you feel the pull of the boxes, the tension between greed and caution, between logic and intuition, between trust in yourself and fear that you're already outmaneuvered. So, which do you take? The transparent safety or the opaque gamble? The paradox won't tell you what's right, because it's not designed to reveal an answer. It's designed to expose how fragile your sense of control really is. It leaves you standing in the strange silence between belief and probability. Not because you lack information, but because too much information fractures choice itself. Let the boxes remain untouched for now. Let the predictor remain silent. Let the decision hang unresolved, because maybe the act of choosing was never about money. Maybe it was always about who you believe yourself to be, when no one is watching, and when everyone is. And beyond the box, the next paradox waits, one that asks not what you'll choose, but whether knowing more will ever help you at all. Temporal double occupancy. Paradox. There's a quiet rule that governs everything we think we understand about existence. No two objects can occupy the exact same space at the exact same time. Matter resists overlap. Identity demands distinction. One moment, one body, one presence. But time travel doesn't respect that rule. It folds space. It loops identity. And somewhere deep in that loop lives the temporal double occupancy paradox, a scenario where one person meets themselves in the exact same point in time, within the same physical timeline, within the same physical universe. You go back. Not a century, not a decade, just days. You're still alive in that earlier moment, breathing, moving, making choices. And now, so are you, again. A second version, an echo that's fully solid. You see yourself. You could touch yourself. You are, for all intents and purposes, coexisting with your own history. So here's the fracture. Can two versions of the same person occupy the same moment in space-time, without the universe breaking itself apart? The problem isn't about logic, it's about identity, mass, and continuity. Because if both versions are real, which one is the true you? Is there a primary and a copy? Or are you both real until one becomes obsolete? This paradox isn't about memories or choices. It's about matter. In physics, two solid forms cannot exist in the same exact place at the same exact time without consequence. And yet, here you are. Twice. Fully conscious. Fully physical. Inhabiting a timeline that once held only one of you. So the paradox splits. If time allows both versions to coexist, then it violates the laws of locality and mass conservation. But if time rejects the second presence, if the act of double occupancy triggers some collapse, some annihilation, then time travel into your own history becomes not just dangerous, but physically impossible. Some theorists try to dodge the paradox by suggesting the timeline branches the moment you arrive, that your appearance creates a fork, an alternate history, so the two versions don't actually share the same past. But this sidestep doesn't answer the real tension, because the paradox isn't about how the universe responds. It's about whether your presence, your body, your consciousness can be duplicated without contradiction. And beneath that, a deeper question is hiding. What does it mean to be you when two of you now exist, parallel, identical, and equally valid? This paradox strikes at the core of personal identity. If your future self meets your past self, and both are aware, both are present, both are choosing, then what does I even mean? You're no longer a single thread. You've become a braid, tangled, layered, circular. And that raises an unsettling possibility. If both the versions continue forward, side by side, who gets to write the future? What if you disagree with yourself? What if one version changes course, diverges, rewrites decisions that haven't yet been made? Now the loop is no longer closed, it frays, and continuity fractures again. You've seen echoes of this in your own life, not through time machines, but through memory. When you look back at a past version of yourself and feel like you're watching someone else, same face, same voice, but you wouldn't make those choices now. You wouldn't speak those words now. And yet, that version of you is still part of your timeline. Temporal double occupancy makes that split literal. It turns inner conflict into external contradiction, and it leaves the timeline gasping for balance. Because if both of you remain, then the timeline must adjust to two centers of agency. And the universe, if it wants to preserve coherence, must decide which version continues. Or do both, and if so, for how long? The paradox won't answer. Because it's not here to be solved, it's here to expose the fragility of linear identity. It reveals that even the most familiar presence, your own, becomes unstable when pressed too hard against time. So let the paradox stand. Let both versions of you exist, side by side, each aware of the other, each uncertain of which one history will honor. The next paradox doesn't duplicate you. It isolates you, traps you between decisions so symmetrical that movement itself becomes impossible. The Sleeping Beauty Problem. You go to sleep on Sunday. Before you close your eyes, you're told a fair coin will be flipped once. Heads or tails. A simple, honest toss. If the coin lands heads, you'll be awakened just once, on Monday. If it lands tails, you'll be awakened twice, on Monday and again on Tuesday. But here's the trick. After each awakening, your memory of the last will be erased. You'll wake up unaware of what day it is, unaware of how many times you've been awakened before. Now, you open your eyes. And the question hits you. What is the probability that the coin landed heads? Your instincts might say 50-50. That's what the coin said. One flip, two equal outcomes. You had no control over it. You were asleep. But there's a problem. A deep, thorny crack in the logic. You are now conscious, awake. And the fact that you're experiencing this moment at all changes what you know. If the coin landed heads, there is only one awakening, Monday. If the coin landed tails, there are two awakenings, Monday and Tuesday. And each time you wake up, you're experiencing one awakening, but without knowing which. You don't know if it's your first, your second, or your only. So here's the paradox. Should you still believe there's a 50% chance the coin landed heads? Or has the mere fact that you are awake increased the odds that it was tails? Welcome to the Sleeping Beauty problem, a paradox of probability, belief, and self-locating uncertainty. It seems harmless, it seems theoretical, but the longer you sit with it, the more it asks about how you measure knowledge inside time. Because if you treat every awakening as equally likely, then 2 out of 3 awakenings happen in a world where the coin was tails. So statistically, you're twice as likely to be in a tails world. Under that logic, the chance the coin landed heads isn't 50%, it's 1 in 3. But if you step back, if you remember that the coin was only flipped once before any of this began, then it feels wrong to change the odds. The flip was fair, and nothing you do after it should matter. So, shouldn't the probability still be 50%? Now you're trapped between 2 answers, and both are mathematically defensible. Both have entire branches of logic built around them, and both reveal a discomfort most people never notice, that the way you ask a question can change the answer. Because this isn't just a puzzle about sleep cycles and coin tosses, it's a test of how you handle self-reference in uncertainty. When you're inside a system, when you're part of the outcome you're trying to calculate, when your own perspective becomes part of the data, the logic begins to wobble. And you've seen this before. You feel it when you check the time twice because you don't trust your memory. You feel it when you're asked to guess the chances of success, even though your own confidence skews the result. You feel it when you wonder whether you're truly making a choice or just playing out a version of yourself that was already set in motion. The Sleeping Beauty problem doesn't ask what happened. It asks what you should believe now that you've woken up. And that's a harder question than it looks, because it exposes how information isn't just about facts. It's about context. It's about when you learn, how you learn, and what you can't unknow about your place in the sequence. The paradox whispers something strange and true. Sometimes the very act of observation changes the odds. Not by touching the event, but by including yourself in the picture. So maybe it's not about heads or tails. Maybe it's about accepting that some problems don't ask for certainty. They ask for awareness. That you might never know what day it is in your life, but you still have to make choices anyway. Let that sit. Let the waking be enough. Not for clarity, but for the reminder that some questions only arise because you're here to ask them. And beyond this waking moment, the next paradox awaits. One that won't ask what you believe, but whether it's possible to believe anything at all when truth eats its own tail. Zeno's arrow paradox. A bow is drawn. An arrow rests, perfectly balanced between tension and release. The archer lets go. The string hums. The arrow slices through the air. But does it ever really move? At first, the question sounds absurd. Of course it moves. You've seen it. You've felt it. Motion is one of the most basic experiences a human being can have. But then the paradox steps in. Not with doubt, but with precision. This is Zeno's arrow paradox, one of the oldest logical traps in philosophy. It doesn't ask whether motion is real. It asks whether our understanding of motion through time makes any sense at all. Zeno, a Greek philosopher born nearly 2,500 years ago, broke movement into a series of frozen slices, a film strip, a slideshow of moments. And in each of those moments, each frame of time, the arrow occupies a single position in space. Not stretched, not smeared, just still. Now, pause that thought. In any one instant, the arrow is not moving. It is simply there, It has a position, it takes up space, but it has no velocity. And if you accept that each instant is motionless, how does motion ever emerge from that? If time is composed of indivisible moments, each of which shows a motionless arrow, then how does movement even begin? You try to reason through it. Maybe motion isn't in the instant, but between them. But between requires time, and time, in this paradox, is already made of these still moments. The arrow never moves in any individual frame, and if all of time is made from such frames, then the paradox stands. How can a sequence of stillness create motion? This isn't just a riddle. It's a challenge to how we define reality in motion, and it opens a door into a deeper tension between how we perceive time and how we try to measure it. You experience movement as continuous, but you measure it in points, in seconds, milliseconds, Planck time. The smaller your measurement, the more still things appear, and eventually you hit the paradox, the limit where measurement collapses the illusion of motion. You've seen this outside of theory, when a hummingbird's wings blur, until you slow down the footage. Frame by frame, they freeze. In every still, the wings are not moving. They just are. And yet, we know the bird flies. So, what is motion, really? Is it just a trick of memory, a sequence stitched together by the mind? Or is it something that cannot be captured, only lived? Zeno's arrow. Paradox forces us to confront the possibility that motion is not made of parts, that it's not the sum of stillness, that maybe time isn't a collection of instants at all, but something else, something continuous, even though our tools can only treat it as discrete. It pushes against the very way we construct experience, because if motion is not found in any individual moment, then maybe no individual moment can fully contain truth. You feel this in thought, in memory, in emotion. Try to freeze a moment of grief or love or clarity, and it slips through your fingers. Because the truth wasn't in the stillness, it was in the flow. The paradox doesn't say the arrow isn't real. It says our language, our numbers, our logic, our mental snapshots may be too blunt to capture something so smooth. So, what do you do with that? You accept that some things are only visible when they're moving. That trying to measure motion by stopping it is like trying to taste a river by holding one drop. Zeno's arrow isn't trapped. We are. Trapped in a view of time that cuts it into slices, then asks why the living parts don't show up in the still ones. Let that contradiction remain unresolved. Not because it lacks an answer, but because motion never asked for one. And in the silence between those still frames, another paradox is forming. Not about where you are, but about how many versions of you may be there at once. Choice. Paradox. There's a shelf at the store, lined with 32 flavors. Every possible variety of sweetness, spice, crunch, and cream. You step up excited, ready to indulge. But 10 minutes later, you're standing there, uncertain, overwhelmed, and oddly, a little unsatisfied. Welcome to the choice paradox. The strange, counterintuitive truth that the more options we have, the harder it becomes to choose, and the less satisfied we feel once we do. It seems backward. We're taught that freedom means options, that to have more choices is to have more control, more power, more happiness. But at some point, the very thing that's supposed to empower us begins to paralyze us, and when we do choose, we second-guess it. Not because what we picked is bad, but because the weight of what we didn't pick starts to feel heavier than what we got. The paradox lives in every aisle, every scroll, every yes and every no. When faced with one option, decision is easy, With 2, you weigh pros and cons. With 3, you begin to consider trade-offs. With 30, you freeze. It's called decision fatigue, but it's more than just exhaustion. It's a fracture in the mind, a collision between freedom and expectation. Because once you believe the perfect option exists, you start looking not just for something good, but for something better than everything else. That's when satisfaction becomes elusive, because even after you choose, you start to wonder, was there a better one I missed? You replay the others in your mind. What if I'd chosen that? What would that have felt like? What did I just give up? And now, you're not living with what you gained. You're haunted by what you didn't. The paradox deepens when we move beyond snacks and screens. It hits harder when the choices carry identity. What career should I pursue? What city should I live in? Who should I love? Each door you walk through means others stay closed. And the more doors you're shown, the more you fear picking the wrong one. Not because the choice is bad, but because too many choices create the illusion that one of them must be perfect. And when none of them are, you blame yourself. The paradox turns freedom into pressure. It makes you feel like every choice defines you. And if you don't get it right, you've wasted something precious. But the truth is, you can only live one life. Only one version of your day, your relationship, your path. And the rest, the options you didn't take, were never guaranteed to be better. Only different. The choice paradox is powerful because it touches our sense of regret. It feeds a quiet voice that says, if you'd chosen differently, you'd be happier by now. But that voice is a lie. Happiness doesn't grow in the volume of what you could have had. It grows in the attention you give to what you chose. It grows when you commit, when you stop looking over your shoulder and stop asking whether something else could have been more. That's not settling. That's presence. That's freedom of a different kind, a kind that doesn't demand perfection. Just peace. The choice paradox won't disappear. The world keeps expanding. More paths, more versions, more flavors. But your peace doesn't grow with the menu. It grows when you know you don't need every option to be fulfilled by just one. Let the unopened doors stay closed. Let the path you didn't walk stay unwritten. You don't have to try everything to know what you want. You just have to choose and let yourself be there fully. Beyond the shelves, beyond the scrolling, another paradox is forming. This time, it won't ask what you choose, but what happens when knowing too much keeps you from choosing anything at all. Buridan's ass. A donkey stands between two identical bales of hay. Both are equal in size, distance, and appeal. Neither one is closer, neither one is better. He is hungry. He is capable of reaching either. And yet, he dies of starvation. This is Buridan's ass. A paradox so quiet it almost reads like a joke, but underneath its simple frame lies a brutal truth about the human condition. That sometimes what destroys us is not confusion or chaos or fear, but indecision. The donkey can't move. Not because he lacks will, but because no option stands out as worth choosing. In a perfectly symmetrical world, his logic betrays him. And so he dies, not for lack of choice, but because choice demanded distinction, and none existed. We live in a world that worships balance. We try to weigh pros and cons. We try to be fair, measured, rational. But Buridan's ass shows what happens when rationality has nothing to lean on. When logic, stripped of intuition, becomes motionless. The paradox doesn't just exist in fables. It plays out in real decisions, quiet, private, paralyzing. Do you leave the relationship that feels stagnant, or stay in the comfort you've built? Both options offer security. Both demand sacrifice. Neither offers clarity. So you wait. Do you take the job with higher pay, or the one with better hours? Do you speak up about what's bothering you, or keep the peace one more day? Do you move or stay, reach out, or go silent? And in waiting for the better reason, you lose time. You lose momentum. You lose life that doesn't pause while you calculate. Decision paralysis is not laziness. It's not fear of action. It's the collapse of movement when reason gives you no ground to stand on. Because if both outcomes are equal, then any choice feels arbitrary. And arbitrariness to the logical mind feels wrong. So we stall, we loop, we sink into thought like it's a safe place. But it isn't. Because thought without motion becomes weight. This paradox gets crueler the more intelligent you are. The more perspectives you hold, the more angles you see, the more you wait for something to prove itself worthy of being chosen. But some choices were never meant to be proven. They were only ever meant to be made. The deeper trap of Buridan's ass is that it convinces you there must be a right decision. But there isn't. Not always. Not in the way we hope. Sometimes the power of a choice isn't in its logic. It's in its finality. You chose. You committed. And the world bent itself around that. Because in the absence of movement, nothing happens. No progress, no learning, no regret even, because regret needs an action to push against. In paralysis, there is only decay. The donkey didn't starve because he couldn't eat. He starved because he couldn't choose to begin. Let that sink in. Now, pull it into your own life. The email you haven't replied to, the path you keep postponing, the truth you've rehearsed but haven't spoken. The paradox teaches that waiting for perfect clarity may cost you everything. That movement, even imperfect, is better than stillness built on equal ground. And here's the secret Buridan never saw. The bales don't have to be different for one to be chosen. You are different the moment you choose. And that difference reshapes the path, so pick. Not out of panic, not out of pressure, but because motion feeds life and hesitation drains it. Let the donkey rest now, not as a cautionary tale, but as a moment of stillness that ends with your first step. And as the step lands, the next paradox opens its door. Not between identical choices, but between choices where knowing more only makes deciding harder. 2 envelopes. Paradox. You're handed 2 sealed envelopes. One of them holds a sum of money. The other holds twice as much. You're told to pick one. Just one. You choose. You hold it in your hands. Then the offer comes. Would you like to switch? You pause. You do the math. If the envelope in your hand contains, say, $100, then the other could contain $200. Or maybe you've got the $200 and the other holds just $100. That part is simple. But then something strange happens. You calculate your expected value, the average amount you might gain or lose by switching. And suddenly, the logic pulls you into a loop. If the envelope you chose contains X dollars, then the other envelope has a 50% chance of being 1/2 X and a 50% chance of being 2X. So the expected value of switching becomes 1/2 times 2X plus 1/2 times 1/2 X equals X plus 1/4. X equals 1.25X. That's more than what you're holding, so you switch. But now you're holding a new envelope. Same logic, same math. Again, it seems better to switch. So you do, and again, and now you're stuck in the two envelopes paradox, an infinite loop of rational decisions that never actually help you. You're trapped by logic that says switching is always better, even though the situation never changes. This paradox exposes a strange flaw in reasoning under uncertainty. Not a failure of math, but a failure of perspective. The math seems airtight, but it assumes something dangerous, that you can assign value to a choice without knowing what you're comparing it to. And that assumption creates an illusion that no matter what envelope you hold, the other is always worth more. It breaks intuition, because in truth, you can't know whether you're holding the smaller or the larger amount, and without knowing that, every probability becomes untethered. A floating number, disconnected from reality. The two envelopes. Paradox is a lesson in how uncertainty can twist logic into obsession, and we live it more than we think. When you compare two jobs, two relationships, two life paths, and find yourself flipping back and forth endlessly, always feeling like the other might have been better, you replay the decision again and again. Each time your current choice feels lacking. Each time, the other path seems richer, fuller, more promising. But nothing changes, just your view. That's what makes the paradox so powerful. It reveals how choice without context becomes a trap. A cycle where rationality eats itself, where every decision leads not to satisfaction, but to more doubt. And here's the twist. The solution isn't about finding the right envelope. It's about recognizing that sometimes more information isn't helpful, that not every situation benefits from deeper calculation, because deeper doesn't always mean clearer, and smarter doesn't always mean wiser. At some point, the healthiest decision is to stop switching, to choose, to accept the value in what you hold, rather than chasing shadows based on probabilities that never stabilize. Let the envelope stay sealed, not because it holds the best outcome, but because it holds an end to the loop. That's the real escape from the two envelopes paradox, not a better gain, but the refusal to be trapped by possibilities without proof. And just as this cycle quiets, another paradox arrives, not with uncertainty, but with a truth so complete that to accept it may mean losing your ability to believe in anything else. Paradox of thrift. You earn a little money. You tuck some of it away. You're cautious, thoughtful, responsible. You cut back. You skip the extras. You hold on to more, because holding on feels safe. It's a personal decision, one that makes sense, and then others do the same. They save, they cut back, they stop spending, but slowly, quietly, something strange begins to happen. Businesses start earning less. Jobs get lost, wages fall, and the economy begins to contract. That's the paradox of thrift, the unsettling idea that when everyone tries to save at the same time, the very thing meant to protect them ends up hurting everyone. On its own, saving is wise. It's a cushion, a defense, a way to prepare for uncertainty. But in large numbers, saving shrinks demand. People buy less. Companies make less. The money that once flowed freely starts to slow. And when that happens, the safety you tried to build for yourself turns into a danger for the system around you. The paradox strikes a deep nerve because it clashes with the way we see responsibility. You're taught that financial discipline is personal, that it's about what you earn, what you keep, what you sacrifice. But in this paradox, your personal prudence can lead to collective collapse. It's not just theoretical. You see it during economic downturns, recessions, depressions, panics. People get scared. They hold on to cash. They stop spending on anything that isn't essential. But when spending stops, businesses can't afford to stay open. Unemployment rises, and the very fear that led to saving becomes the reason for deeper loss. The paradox of thrift is rooted in the logic of macroeconomics, where what's wise for the individual can be catastrophic when practiced by everyone at once. It forces a confrontation. What happens when doing the right thing for yourself contributes to the wrong outcome for society? And deeper still, what does that say about how we're all connected? Because this paradox doesn't just expose an economic flaw, it reveals a truth we often resist, that personal decisions are never entirely personal. That your quiet choice to hold back can ripple outward, until the system you were trying to protect yourself from is one you helped weaken. And yet, this isn't about blame, it's about balance, because saving is necessary, preparation is smart. But the paradox whispers, there's a tipping point, and once crossed, safety becomes scarcity. You've felt this outside economics, in relationships, when both people hold back, waiting for the other to open up. Each trying not to get hurt, each unintentionally building silence. And the connection withers, not because of cruelty, but because of mutual restraint. The same happens in communities. When fear leads to withdrawal. When no one steps forward to lead, because everyone's waiting to see what others will do. The paradox of thrift reveals a hard truth. Sometimes survival requires trust, requires risk, requires that we act in ways that are slightly uncomfortable alone, so that something stronger can hold together in the whole. Because when everyone saves, no one spends. When no one spends, businesses fail. And when businesses fail, jobs vanish. And when jobs vanish, no one can save. The very instinct that was meant to protect turns into a loop that breaks. Let that loop be seen for what it is. Not a mistake in morality, but a mirror of interdependence. Your money doesn't move in a vacuum. Your effort doesn't echo in silence. What you keep affects what others can give, and what you hold back affects what others receive. The paradox of thrift ends not with more saving, but with a return to trust, with shared movement, with enough safety to spend, not recklessly, but confidently, knowing the system can hold. Let the hands open, let the flow resume. Because hoarding won't shield you if the house collapses. And just beyond that fragile balance, another paradox is waiting. One where the act of helping others may quietly work against those you try to save. Abilene Paradox. A family sits around a table in the middle of a hot Texas afternoon. Someone suggests driving to Abilene for dinner, 4 hours away. It's dusty, it's uncomfortable. The car has no air conditioning, but everyone nods in agreement. No one wants to be the one who says no. So, they go. Hours later, they return, exhausted, miserable. And one by one, they start to admit it. None of them actually wanted to go. They only agreed because they thought everyone else wanted to. That's the Abilene Paradox. When a group of people, each privately disagreeing, go along with a collective decision that no one individually supports. It's not a story about indecision. It's a story about assumed consensus, about how silence becomes agreement, about how people betray their own preferences, not because of pressure, but because of politeness, fear, or the quiet weight of not wanting to disappoint. The paradox isn't about going to Abilene. It's about how false agreement can trap a whole group in a path nobody chose. It starts with a suggestion, a simple plan, and instead of questioning it, you read the room, you look around, you guess. They seem fine with it, so you nod. But they're doing the same, reading you, thinking, if they're okay with it, I won't be the one to ruin it. And suddenly, you're all headed toward an outcome that none of you wanted, but none of you resisted. This isn't about weakness, it's about miscommunication wrapped in good intentions. No one wants to rock the boat. No one wants to seem difficult. No one wants to be the one who says, "Actually, I'm not in favor of this." So instead, people go along. They self-censor, they nod, and deep inside, they wait for someone else to say what they're thinking. But no one ever does, and so the group moves forward toward a decision that doesn't reflect anyone's truth. The Abilene paradox shows up in boardrooms, classrooms, families, governments. It shows up in marriages, in friend groups, in social movements that take turns no one really wanted to make. It teaches that groups don't just fail because of conflict. Sometimes they fail because of false harmony, because everyone is trying so hard to protect the group that no one protects the truth. The hardest part is that it looks like agreement. It sounds like agreement, but it's hollow. No one's happy, no one feels heard. And everyone walks away wondering, why didn't someone speak up? The paradox grows stronger in cultures that reward harmony over honesty, where going with the flow is treated as maturity, where disagreement is mistaken for disloyalty. And yet, what's truly dangerous isn't disagreement. It's the silence that grows when people stop believing their voice matters. But the solution isn't rebellion, it's courageous honesty. The kind that says, before we commit to this, can we ask, does anyone actually want to? Because sometimes the bravest person in the room is the one who risks a little discomfort to keep the whole group from wasting years chasing something no one believed in. The Abilene paradox doesn't demand better answers. It demands better questions. And it rewards environments where speaking up feels safe. Not punished, not awkward, not lonely. Let the story of the unwanted trip stay with you. Not as a warning, but as a map back to honest dialogue. Because silence isn't always agreement, and nodding doesn't always mean yes. Sometimes it just means everyone is waiting for someone else to go first. Let that someone be you. And just as the silence breaks, another paradox enters. One where helping others becomes the very thing that quietly, tragically leads them toward failure. Value. Paradox. You reach for a glass of water. It's cold, clean, and costs next to nothing. Now, think about a diamond. Flawless, clear, and worth thousands. One keeps you alive, the other sits on a finger. And yet, in every economy, every culture, across centuries, the diamond is more expensive. This is the value paradox, also called the paradox of value, and it forces us to ask a question we think we already understand. What makes something valuable? It seems obvious that value should follow need. You need water to survive. Without it, life ends, within days. Diamonds? You can live a full life and never touch one. But in the marketplace, it's the diamond that commands a fortune. And water? Often free, often ignored. So, where does this contradiction come from? The answer starts by separating total value from marginal value. Water, in most places, is abundant. You have more than enough. So, the next glass of water, the next sip, the next drop, isn't worth much because you're not desperate for it. Diamonds, on the other hand, are rare, hard to find, difficult to cut, polish, transport, so the next diamond is always harder to come by and therefore more desirable, even if it serves no purpose. And that's where the paradox begins to open. Because value is not only about utility, it's about context. It's about perceived scarcity, and it's about the story we attach to the object. Water is taken for granted until it's gone. In a desert, you would trade every diamond in the world for one drink, but that doesn't raise water's price on a supermarket shelf, because value in economic systems is rarely about what's essential. It's about what people will pay for and why. The paradox exposes how our systems of value are psychological before they are logical. We assign worth based not on survival, but on rarity, symbolism, and demand. You see this in everything. A signature on a napkin can be worth millions if the right person wrote it. A handbag can cost more than a year of groceries, not because it feeds you, but because it tells a story about status. A digital image, infinitely reproducible, can sell for the price of a house because someone agreed it was scarce. The value paradox reveals that we don't just trade goods, we trade meaning. We pay for how things make us feel, what they say about us, how they stand apart. But this truth comes with risk. Because when value is shaped by perception, necessity can be overlooked. Clean water is still inaccessible to millions. Medicine can be cheaper than designer shoes. Teachers may earn less than influencers. Essential work, caregiving, cleaning, farming, can be paid the least, not because it lacks value, but because it lacks visibility in the marketplace of want. And so the paradox forces a question back onto us. Have we mistaken rarity for importance? Have we priced the world backward, rewarding the symbolic over the essential? But the paradox isn't here to judge, it's here to reveal. It tells us that systems built on perception will always elevate the exceptional, while the vital slips into the background. And if we want a different world, one where what matters most is seen, supported, protected, then value must be redefined. Not erased, not equalized, but realigned, so that the water in your hand isn't just cheap, but respected, so that survival isn't priced below status, so that need isn't drowned in novelty. Let the diamond shine if it must, but let the water remind us, what glitters isn't always what sustains. And just beyond that quiet recognition, another paradox waits, not about price, but about visibility itself. Why people who have more often feel like they have less. Paradox of voting. You walk into a voting booth. One small ballot, one check mark. You cast your vote, then you leave, and nothing changes, at least not visibly, not because of you. The result would have been the same whether you voted or not. One vote among millions. Statistically insignificant. And yet you showed up. This is the paradox of voting, a contradiction that lives quietly at the heart of every democracy. It asks, why would anyone participate in a system where their individual impact is almost zero? But their participation is essential for the system to work at all. Rational choice theory says you shouldn't bother. The effort isn't worth the effect. The cost, however small, outweighs the benefit, because the probability of changing the outcome is microscopic. You don't vote to be decisive. You vote knowing you won't be. And yet, every election depends on people doing exactly that. If everyone followed the logic, if everyone stayed home because their one vote wouldn't matter, no one would vote. And the system would collapse under the weight of its own individual rationality. So, why do people keep showing up? Because the paradox has a second layer, one that isn't about outcomes, but about identity. You vote because it aligns with who you believe you are. A citizen, a participant, a voice, not a decider, just one note in the chorus. It's a ritual of belonging, a statement of principle, a way to say, I was part of this, even if the result wasn't mine. And here lies the paradox's strength. While your vote may not sway the result, withholding it says more than you realize. Because mass participation is a signal, a reflection of trust, belief, investment in the system. And low turnout, it's a signal too. A quiet warning that the system may no longer reflect those it claims to serve. So now the paradox unfolds. You vote not because your one vote changes the world, but because without it, the world may no longer include you. This tension between powerlessness and necessity exists everywhere, not just in politics. You recycle knowing the plastic may end up in a landfill. You donate knowing it won't fix the system. You speak up knowing your voice may be lost in the noise, but you still act, because action, even small, carries meaning. And that meaning isn't found in the effect, it's found in the intention, in the refusal to be silent, in the belief that value doesn't need to be measurable to be real. The paradox of voting teaches that systems survive not on logic alone, but on shared responsibility. Even if your hand is just one on the rope does not move without you. Let that truth settle. Your vote won't decide the outcome, but it decides whether you are part of the process or absent from it. And the health of any system is revealed not in who wins, but in how many felt it was worth showing up. Let the ballot fall. Let the process breathe. Because the paradox doesn't break democracy. It builds it, one statistically insignificant, entirely necessary voice at a time. And just beyond that paper and silence, another paradox unfolds, one where the more connected people become, the lonelier they often feel. Paradox of hedonism. You want to be happy, of course you do. Everyone does, so you chase it. Through comfort, through success, through pleasure, through peace, through more. But somehow, the more directly you pursue happiness, the more it slips from reach. This is the paradox of hedonism, the quiet contradiction that says, the more you aim for happiness, the harder it is to find. It doesn't matter how sincere the intention is. You can read the books, repeat the affirmations, take the trips, earn the money. But when the goal is happiness itself, when that becomes the center of your effort, something turns hollow. Because happiness isn't a thing you catch. It's not a target, it's not a prize at the end of effort, it's a byproduct, something that comes not when it's chased, but when it's allowed. That's the paradox. Joy arrives most often when you're not looking for it. In the side moments. In a shared glance. In doing work that matters. In giving, listening, showing up for someone else. And the moment you try to capture it, to bottle it, to define it, it starts to vanish. This is the great trick of the human mind. When you make happiness your aim, you start evaluating everything in terms of how it makes you feel. And that evaluation, constant, persistent, kills the feeling before it has time to grow. You eat the dessert, not because you're enjoying it, but because you think it should make you feel joy. You sit in the sunshine, not because it warms you, but because you read somewhere that it's good for your mood. You go on the trip, take the photo, post the memory. All while checking if the moment is as fulfilling as you hoped. And so the joy is never just joy. It's a test, a comparison, a benchmark that never quite gets met. The paradox of hedonism teaches that pleasure isn't wrong. It's just incomplete when pursued for its own sake. The richest happiness often shows up as a side effect. When you're absorbed in something larger than yourself. Creating, helping, connecting, solving problems, losing track of time, being present in the task, not the reward. It's not that you shouldn't want happiness, it's that you shouldn't hold it so tightly that everything else fades behind it. Because the more obsessed you become with feeling good, the more sensitive you become to not feeling good. The smallest discomfort feels like failure. The quiet days feel like loss. And the mind, always measuring, starts to erode what little joy might have existed, and you've seen it. People who have everything they thought would make them happy yet feel restless, anxious, empty, because happiness isn't found in what you have, but in what you stop needing to have. Let the paradox reshape the question. Don't ask, what will make me happy? Ask, what is worth doing even if it doesn't? Because when your focus shifts from happiness to meaning, from comfort to presence, from seeking to serving, joy arrives on its own. Unexpected, unforced, real, and maybe that's the truest happiness of all. The kind that doesn't demand to be felt because you're too busy living to notice it arrived. Let the pursuit rest now. Not because happiness isn't important, but because it was never the destination. It was always the echo. And just as that echo fades, another paradox rises. Not about joy, but about popularity, where those with the most connections often feel the most alone. Jevons paradox. You invent a better engine. It uses less fuel. It's cheaper to run. It's faster, cleaner, quieter. The future looks brighter because you've made something more efficient. But then, something unexpected happens. Because it's cheaper, more people use it. Because it's faster, they drive farther. Because it saves money, it spreads faster than ever. And in the end, total fuel consumption rises. Pollution increases, congestion worsens. Your efficiency, meant to conserve, has caused more to be spent. That's Jevons' paradox, a quiet contradiction at the heart of progress. The more efficient a resource becomes, the more likely it is to be overused. It was first observed in 1865, when economist William Stanley Jevons studied coal consumption in Britain. He noticed that better steam engines, designed to use less coal, didn't reduce coal usage, they increased it. Because efficiency didn't reduce demand, it amplified it. We still carry this contradiction in everything we build. You create a light bulb that uses less electricity. Now people leave the lights on longer. You build cars with better mileage. Now people commute farther. You invent faster computers. Now people run more apps, store more data, expect more processing. You make something easier to use, and instead of using it less, you remove the friction that once limited overuse. Jevons' paradox is not just about resources, it's about behavior. It shows how we misunderstand the consequences of progress when we look only at the part, not the whole. We assume that saving in one place equals saving overall. But systems don't work that way. They expand, they rebound, they adapt to improvements by finding new ways to consume more. And that's the paradox. Efficiency does not guarantee conservation. In fact, it often ensures the opposite. This happens in economics, in energy, in technology, even in our personal lives. You find a quicker way to answer emails, so you write more emails. You streamline your schedule, so you take on more responsibilities. You speed up your workouts, and now expect even more productivity from your day. The time you saved doesn't become rest. It becomes opportunity for more strain. Because modern culture worships optimization, but optimization doesn't ask whether you should do something, only whether you can do it faster, cheaper, more. And so we spin in a cycle of gains that quietly fuel deeper losses. Jevons' paradox warns us, be careful what your innovations remove. When effort disappears, so do natural breaks. When cost lowers, demand rises. When friction fades, consumption scales, often past what we ever imagined. But this isn't a condemnation of efficiency. It's a reminder that design is not destiny. Efficiency must be paired with intention, with structure, with limits, not just tools. Progress is real, but it must come with discipline, or it will double back on itself. Let that be the lesson, not to halt invention, But to understand that invention without wisdom loops into excess. Let the machine run smarter, but only if we remember that what we save today can still cost us tomorrow. And just beyond the engine's hum, another paradox waits, not in energy, but in connection, where the more people we know, the more isolated we might feel. The Monty Hall problem. You're standing on a game show stage. 3 doors, 1 prize, 2 goats. You pick a door, say door number 1. You don't know what's behind it yet. Then the host, who does know, opens another door, say door number 3. Behind it is a goat. Nothing more. Now you're given a choice. Stick with your original door, or switch to the other unopened one. Simple, right? Your instincts say it doesn't matter. 2 doors, 1 prize, 50-50. But math says something very different. Switching gives you a 2/3 chance of winning. Sticking gives you just 1/3. And that's the Monty Hall problem. A probability paradox that breaks your intuition, then breaks it again. It's named after the host of an old TV show, Let's Make a Deal, where this exact situation played out. But behind the bright lights and music, this little game reveals something deeply unsettling. Your instincts can be perfectly confident, and still completely wrong. Here's what's really happening. When you pick your first door, you have a 1 in 3 chance of being right. That means there's a 2 in 3 chance the prize is behind one of the other 2. Monty then opens one of those other 2, always revealing a goat. That doesn't make your original odds better. It just compresses the entire 2 in 3 probability into the only remaining unopened door. The act of revealing one wrong option doesn't split the odds, it shifts them. And yet, even when people are told this, even after seeing it proven through endless simulations and classroom demonstrations, most still feel that switching is risky. They cling to their first choice because it feels earned, because letting go feels like betrayal, because doing nothing feels safer than changing course. This isn't just a math problem. It's a window into how the human brain handles uncertainty and commitment. We are wired to avoid loss. Once we pick something, especially in public, especially when it's ours, we anchor to it. We want to defend it. We overvalue it, even when the numbers tell us we're wrong. The Monty Hall problem isn't about goats or prizes. It's about how intuition and reason can pull in opposite directions. And when they do, most people trust their gut. You've felt this elsewhere. You start a project, realize it's not working, but keep pouring time into it because you've already invested so much. You commit to a job, a relationship, a path, and when a better option appears, you hesitate, because switching feels like admitting you were wrong the first time, even when it's objectively better. The paradox teaches that change doesn't mean failure, it means adaptation. And often, in uncertainty, the most rational move feels like a risk, but the real risk is clinging to what's familiar, just because you picked it first. So, what do? You learn to trust the numbers over the noise. You learn to spot the moments when loyalty becomes limitation. You learn that switching isn't weakness. Sometimes it's wisdom. And most of all, you accept that certainty is a feeling, not a fact. Let that door stay open, not to the prize, but to the idea that what feels wrong can still be right. And just as that realization settles in, another paradox waits. One where fairness leads not to equity, but to imbalance. Gambler's fallacy. A coin flips, heads, again, heads, then again, heads, 3 in a row, 4, 5. By the 6th toss, something inside you begins to tighten. It has to be tails next, right? That's the trap. That's the gambler's fallacy, the deeply human, deeply misleading belief that past random events affect future outcomes, even when they don't. It's the sense that a pattern must balance out, that the universe keeps score, that chance is fair, and fairness means alternation. But probability doesn't work that way. In a fair coin toss, heads and tails are always 50-50, no matter what happened before. The coin has no memory, no conscience, no debt to repay. But your brain tells a different story. It whispers, 5 heads in a row? That's unnatural. Tails is overdue. The odds must have shifted. But they haven't. This fallacy shows up everywhere we try to find meaning in randomness. A roulette wheel lands on black 4 times. You bet on red, thinking it's more likely now. But it's not. Each spin is independent. Each outcome is sealed off from what came before. Yet we don't see randomness that way. We see streaks, patterns, justice. Because the human mind is built to detect order, even where none exists. It's how we survived. It's how we learned to read the sky, the seasons, the faces of others. But that same instinct misfires in places where chance rules. The gambler's fallacy isn't about gambling. It's about misunderstanding independence. It's believing the dice remember. It's treating luck like it's personal, like it owes you. And it gets worse with emotion. The more you've lost, the more you believe a win is coming. The deeper the streak, the more you feel like you're due. But randomness doesn't deal in redemption. It doesn't fix itself. It doesn't lean toward fairness. It just is. This fallacy infects more than games. You apply for jobs, you get 5 rejections, you feel like an acceptance has to be next, but it doesn't. You go on bad dates, you think, I'm due for a good one. But the universe isn't counting. You work hard for years without recognition. You start to believe fate will balance it out. But fairness is not a guarantee, and time does not carry promise. The gambler's fallacy is comforting because it makes randomness feel moral. Like effort guarantees reward. Like loss builds credit. Like chance is watching you and will make things even. But it won't. The only cure is to accept the purity of randomness. To know that odds reset with every toss, every spin, every decision. That 6 heads in a row doesn't change the next flip. That your bad luck isn't building toward balance. It's just part of the curve. And yet, that doesn't mean you stop hoping. It means you hope with clarity. You act with awareness. You place your bets on things you can shape, your preparation, your resilience, your choices, not the spin of a wheel. Let the fallacy fall away. Let chance be what it is. Because the moment you stop forcing fairness onto randomness, you begin to see clearly where your true influence lies. And just beyond that clarity, another paradox waits, one that breaks the rules of connection, where the more popular your friends are, the less popular you feel. Lottery, paradox. You're handed a ticket, it's one of a million. You look at it and you know, rationally, statistically, confidently, this ticket is a loser. So, you move on to the next one, same feeling, same logic. You go through the list one by one. Each individual ticket? Almost certainly not the winner. That's what reason says. And yet, you also know, one of them must win. This is the lottery paradox, a sharp contradiction in how we trust logic, especially under uncertainty. It exposes something unnerving about belief. You can believe every single individual claim is true, and still know the overall conclusion must be false. You can believe that each ticket will lose, because the odds are overwhelmingly against any single one. But if you believe that for every ticket, you're left believing that none will win. And that contradicts the entire setup. So now the tension begins, because all your reasoning is sound, but your conclusion is broken. The paradox doesn't ask whether you'll win the lottery. It asks what it means to believe something rational, when rationality breaks in bulk. It's a problem of aggregated reasoning, where the parts make sense, but the whole does not. And this isn't just a puzzle about probability. It's a mirror for how we build belief. You meet a dozen people in a room. Each one seems unlikely to be the one who will lie to you, and yet, the group includes a liar. You trust them all, and you're guaranteed to be wrong about at least one. You review 1,000 documents. Each seems unlikely to contain the critical error, but you know there's one mistake hidden somewhere, and still, each page looks fine. So which do you flag? The lottery paradox appears anywhere a large set of low-probability beliefs must be held simultaneously. And it shakes the foundation of what we mean when we say something is reasonable to believe. Because if believing each individual claim leads you to deny a necessary truth, then what does it mean to reason at all? The paradox cracks open a question few people want to face. Can rationality be wrong, even when every step is right, and the implications ripple out? You might trust the safety of a product because the chance of failure is low, and yet, enough of those low chances add up to real harm. You might feel safe in a crowd because no one person seems dangerous, and still, one is. This paradox doesn't accuse you of being irrational. It reveals that rationality, without structure, can't scale. It needs rules for belief, for doubt, for when to stop trusting each part just because each part looks safe. It's why institutions exist, why standards of evidence matter, why systems are built to catch what intuition can't. Because on your own, you will underestimate how quickly reasonable beliefs turn into a collective contradiction. Let that contradiction breathe. Let it remind you that belief, like risk, like truth, is not just about single events. It's about the patterns they form when they stack together. And while any one ticket may feel like a loser, you cannot believe that all of them are. Not because of hope, but because of certainty. One must win, and knowing that while still doubting each part is where logic bends. Let that bend remain, not as failure but as a limit, the edge of where personal certainty ends and collective reasoning begins. And beyond that edge, another paradox is waiting, not in chance but in connections, where the more people you know, the lonelier your world may become. The preface. Paradox. You've written a book. It's taken years, filled with research, care, peer review, and thousands of facts. You've checked your sources, rechecked your logic. Each chapter is solid. You stand by every claim. And yet, in the opening pages, the preface, you add a small disclaimer. Something like, though I believe every statement in this book is true, I expect that at least one of them is wrong. That line sounds humble, responsible, but it also shatters something, because now you've declared two things at once. Each individual claim is true, and yet at least one of them is false. Welcome to the preface paradox, a subtle but powerful contradiction in how we deal with belief, knowledge, and the limits of certainty. It lives quietly in the space between confidence and caution, and it asks, can you honestly believe every single thing you say while also believing that some of it is probably wrong? Logically, it seems inconsistent. If you think one of your beliefs is likely to be false, why not try to find out which one and change it? But you don't know which one it is. You've already examined them all. You've trusted them enough to write them down. Still, you know you're human. You know error is inevitable. And so the disclaimer stays. This paradox sits right at the core of intellectual humility. Because the more thoughtful you are, the more you're aware of how often smart, careful people have been wrong in the past, the more you accept that some part of what you believe right now must be flawed. But if you accept that, how can you still believe anything at all? It's a strange balancing act to believe something confidently, while also accepting the fallibility of belief itself. And yet, it's a balance you live every day. You trust your memory, even though it's imperfect. You trust your judgment, even though it's biased. You trust your knowledge, while knowing it's incomplete. The preface paradox doesn't expose arrogance. It exposes fragility. The soft underside of belief that knows truth doesn't always mean accuracy, and it raises deeper questions. Is belief about certainty, or is it about reasonable trust, even in the shadow of doubt? When scientists publish a theory, they often add caveats, margin of error, limitations, unknown variables, but that doesn't mean they don't believe their findings. It means they understand that truth lives in probability, not perfection. To believe without question is dogma. To question without belief is paralysis. But to hold both, to believe with open hands, is where real understanding begins. The preface paradox teaches that rational people can believe each part of what they say, while still acknowledging that the whole may include hidden cracks. And instead of weakening belief, this acknowledgement strengthens it, because it means your beliefs are flexible, self-aware, willing to adjust in the light of new evidence. It turns knowledge into a living thing. Not a rigid wall of facts, but a breathing framework that allows growth, revision, and complexity. Let that be enough. Let it be okay that you believe what you believe, even if you also believe some part of it will someday be proven wrong. That isn't contradiction, that's honesty. And in a world where certainty often shouts the loudest, humble belief is one of the rarest and most powerful forms of integrity. As the ink dries on that preface, another paradox opens its door, not one about belief, but about connection, where popularity bends perception and your friends may be more connected than you are. Hilbert's Hotel. There's a hotel that stretches forever, an infinite row of rooms numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on without end. Every room is full. Every guest has checked in, but now a new traveler arrives, hoping to stay the night. And somehow, there's still space. This is Hilbert's Hotel, a paradox drawn from the mind of German mathematician David Hilbert, a thought experiment built to expose the wild logic of infinity. At first glance, the hotel feels impossible. If every room is occupied, how can there be room for more? But here's the trick. The manager shifts the guest in room 1 to room 2, room 2 to room 3, room 3 to room 4, on and on, endlessly. Each person moves to the room one number higher, and suddenly, room 1 is vacant. The new guest steps in. No one was evicted. No new rooms were added. Yet a hotel that was completely full now holds more. This is the strange arithmetic of infinity, where adding does not increase and subtracting doesn't reduce, where intuition collapses and reason bends into something both precise and absurd. Hilbert's Hotel isn't about real architecture. It's about what happens when the rules of the finite world stop working, and it doesn't stop with one new guest. If a bus arrives with infinite passengers, you can still accommodate them. Move each current guest to the room twice their number. 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 4, 3 to 6, and so on. Now, all odd-numbered rooms are free. An entire infinity of space opens up, inside an infinity that was already full. This isn't a riddle. It's mathematics, a demonstration that infinity is not a number. It's a concept, a direction, a magnitude that behaves in ways the human mind cannot fully grasp. In our daily lives, infinity doesn't show up. we count things, we measure time, we deal in limits. But in math, infinity is real. It's used in calculus, in set theory, in physics, and in every corner it touches, Hilbert's Hotel lingers, reminding us that logic must stretch in order to hold it. Because in an infinite set, the whole can be the same size as the part. You can remove infinitely many elements and still have infinitely many left. You can double something, and it remains exactly the same size. Infinity breaks symmetry. It dissolves the rules of subtraction, addition, division, and yet it obeys its own strange order. A structure more consistent than instinct, but less forgiving than common sense. You feel the echo of Hilbert's Hotel in more than math. You feel it in thought, in memory, in how one idea leads to another without end. You feel it in the sky, how space has no edge, how time has no bottom, and you feel it in paradox itself, how the deeper you go, the more doors open. Hilbert's Hotel isn't here to confuse you. It's here to humble you, to show that infinity isn't a destination, it's a space of endless reorganization. You never run out of room. You just find new ways to move what's already there. And that movement, that impossibly elegant shifting of everything, is the real lesson. Because sometimes the problem isn't capacity, it's perspective. Let the hallways stretch, let the room shift, let logic learn to breathe beyond what the senses can grasp. And just past that ever-expanding corridor, another paradox waits, not of size, but of scale, where what seems rare becomes common, and what's average becomes lonely. Gabriel's horn. Start with a curve, gentle, descending, never quite flat. It stretches endlessly to the right, dipping lower and lower, but never touching the axis. Now spin that curve around the horizontal line. What forms is a hollow body, a trumpet that widens quickly at first, then narrows, and never stops. This is Gabriel's horn, also called Torricelli's trumpet, a geometric object that at first glance seems simple, almost elegant. But beneath its clean surface lives a contradiction so sharp, it splits logic from intuition. This horn stretches forever. It is infinitely long. There is no end to its tunnel. No cap, no final segment, no point of rest. And yet, its surface area is infinite, while its volume is finite. Let that sink in. You can fill the horn with a fixed amount of paint. Say 1 gallon, it's enough. It settles inside, it fills every corner of the infinite tunnel. But that same gallon will never be enough to paint its outer surface. You could keep painting forever, and still never finish. This is not a trick, not an illusion, it's real mathematics. The paradox arises from how we define area and volume. From the way small changes, compounded infinitely, create shapes that break ordinary expectations. The volume of Gabriel's horn can be calculated. It converges to a specific number, a measurable, finite total. But the surface area, it grows and grows and grows, reaching toward infinity no matter how deep you go. This means the horn can be filled, but not coated. It can be held, but not covered. Its inside is smaller than its outside, even though both go on forever. You hear that, and your mind resists. How can something go on forever and still be fully contained? How can you pour something into an endless shape, but never wrap your hands around it? This is where intuition fails. Because intuition grew up in a world of walls and boxes, not infinite curves. Gabriel's horn shows that infinity can be contained, but never finished. It teaches that limits are not always where things stop. Sometimes they're where things stretch so thin they vanish into math. And deeper still, it whispers something stranger. That infinite doesn't mean big, and finite doesn't mean small. Infinity is a direction, not a size. It's not how much, it's how far. Gabriel's horn doesn't show up in real life. No physical object can embody it perfectly. But the paradox reflects truths we live every day. How your thoughts can run forever in a mind that fits inside a skull. How you can feel stretched thin across responsibilities that never end, yet still wake up each morning with more room inside. How time can pass endlessly, but your presence, this moment, still feels full. Gabriel's horn reminds us that we live in a world where paradox is baked into the fabric of logic, where shapes don't always obey the rules we expect, where some infinities fit inside a teacup, and others never finish expanding, even after forever. Let the horn ring out, not as a sound, but as a signal, that you don't always need to make sense of the shape. Only accept that it holds more than one kind of truth. And as the curve fades into infinity, we turn now to the final paradox of the night. Not about shape, not about numbers, but about presence. Where the more friends you have, the more likely it is that your friends have more friends than you. Bonnet-Tarski paradox. You start with a solid sphere. Perfect, round, smooth. The kind you might hold in your hands, if not for what's about to happen to it. Mathematically, logically, you slice that sphere into 5 distinct pieces. Each piece is carefully defined, shaped by the strange edges of set theory. Then you move them, you rotate, you shift. You don't stretch them, don't scale them. You don't add anything at all. And when you're finished, you now have 2 identical spheres, each the same size as the one you started with. Not half-sized, not shrunken, 2 entire spheres from one. This is the Bonnet-Tarski paradox, a theorem in set theoretic geometry that says, under certain conditions, you can take one finite volume and rearrange it into 2 equal copies, without violating any mathematical rules. And yet, it's impossible. Not just physically, philosophically, viscerally. It defies everything you know about matter, volume, and space. This isn't a trick of illusion. It's not sleight of hand. It's a mathematically proven consequence of the axiom of choice. A principle that allows you to construct certain kinds of sets even if you can't explicitly describe them. But those sets, they're so wild, so fragmented, that they don't behave like real objects anymore. They break the rules of volume. They dissolve the concept of shape. They are made of uncountably infinite points, torn apart and reassembled in a way that no physical substance could ever mimic. And yet, the math holds. That's what makes the Bonnet-Tarski paradox so unsettling. Because the logic is solid, the proof is rigorous, and the conclusion is absurd. From 1, you get 2. From finite, you get infinite potential. Without stretching, shrinking, or cheating. This paradox isn't just about spheres. It's about how fragile your sense of reality becomes when infinity enters the room. Because in the abstract world of pure math, space behaves differently. It's not continuous, it's not tangible, it's not made of anything you can touch. And when you accept the axiom of choice, a foundational principle used across set theory, you also accept that such constructions are possible, even if they make no physical sense at all. This tension between mathematical truth and physical impossibility is the heart of the Bonnet-Tarski paradox. It shows that truth doesn't always equal reality, that some truths live in systems you can never build, can never see, can never test. You feel it in other places too. In quantum mechanics, where particles exist in superposition. In logic, where self-reference collapses certainty. In the limits of knowledge itself, where reason goes further than understanding can follow. The Banach-Tarski paradox is a monument to the power and danger of abstraction. It reminds us that math isn't just a tool. It's a universe of its own, one where the rules are internally consistent, but often incompatible with what we can observe. It forces us to ask, when does a model stop being useful? When does logic become too detached from the world it seeks to describe? Let the sphere remain, duplicated in silence. Not as a physical object, but as a symbol of how far thought can stretch. Because this paradox isn't just about duplication. It's about the limits of comprehension. About what happens when certainty outpaces sense. Let that discomfort stay. Let it echo through the chambers of reason. Because the Banach-Tarski paradox is not meant to be solved. It's meant to be witnessed. And just beyond that impossibility, the final paradox comes into view. A quiet social illusion, where your friends, on average, have more friends than you. Cantor's diagonal paradox. Start with a list, a long one, an infinite one. Each entry is a number between 0 and 1, written out in decimal form, like 0,137, 0,721, 0,003. They stretch out across the page, each digit going on forever. Now, try to list every possible decimal number between 0 and 1. You think it should be doable. After all, the counting numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on are infinite, and we've learned to work with them. So maybe these decimal numbers can be arranged in a neat line too, matched 1-to-1 with those familiar integers. But they can't. That's the paradox. This is Cantor's diagonal paradox, a revelation that not all infinities are equal. Some are so vast, so dense, so deeply unlistable, they outgrow even infinity itself. Here's how it works. You build your infinite list, 1 decimal per line. Then you create a new number. You go down the diagonal of the list, 1 digit from each number. Take the first digit from the first number, the second from the second, the third from the third, and so on. Now, change each of those digits just slightly. If it's a 3, make it a 4. If it's a 7, make it a 2. With that, you've built a new number that is different from every number in the list. At least at 1 digit. It differs from the first at the first digit, the second at the second digit, the third at the third, forever. Which means it's not on the list. No matter how complete your list seemed, no matter how infinite, there will always be numbers missing. There's no complete listing, no total capture. The real numbers between 0 and 1 cannot be counted. Not even with infinite patience. They form a set so large, so unmatchable, that it's not just infinite, it's a higher order of infinite. Georg Cantor, the mathematician behind this, shattered the idea that infinity was a single concept. He showed that there are levels of infinity, that the infinity of real numbers is strictly larger than the infinity of natural numbers. And that changes everything, because we tend to think of infinity as absolute, as the end of the line. But Cantor proved that there is no end of the line. Once you open the door to infinity, you find it's not a room, it's a staircase. And there's always a higher step. The diagonal argument isn't just clever, it's profound. It proves that there is no complete catalog of the real, no full list, no final accounting. And you feel this beyond mathematics, in language, in art, in memory. There is always one thought, one feeling, one variation that hasn't yet been said, hasn't yet been drawn, hasn't yet been listed. Infinity isn't repetition, it's newness without end. Cantor's diagonal paradox invites you to release the idea that the world can be fully grasped, fully named, fully held in order. Some things are forever uncountable, not because we failed, but because they were never meant to fit in a list. And this is not limitation, it's freedom, because it means the unknown will always exist, that no matter how much we explore, there will always be more. Let the diagonal grow. Let it carry you beyond what can be mapped, because that's where the mystery lives. And in that mystery, one final paradox comes to rest, where your sense of connection is quietly reshaped by math itself. A paradox that makes you question whether you are really as connected as you thought, because, on average, your friends have more friends than you. Zeno's dichotomy. There's a man standing still. He wants to walk to a wall across the room. Simple enough. To get there, he must first cover half the distance. So he takes a step forward. Now he's halfway there. But before he can reach the wall, he must now cover half the remaining distance. So he steps again. Half of what's left. Still not there. Now half of that distance. And again, and again. With each step he gets closer, but each step is half as long, and there are infinitely many steps left to take. So the question becomes, if he must take an infinite number of steps to reach the wall, will he ever get there at all? Welcome to Zeno's dichotomy paradox, an ancient argument that pushes back against your every instinct. It's one of several paradoxes posed by Zeno of Elea in the 5th century BCE, each designed to challenge the very idea of motion. This one targets beginnings and completions. Because if motion is made of steps, and there are infinitely many steps between any 2 points, how can motion ever even start? And if it does start, how can it ever end? Mathematically, this seems absurd. We know people reach walls. We see it happen every day. But Zeno wasn't denying movement. He was revealing a contradiction in how we understand it. The paradox is built from simple logic. To get from A to B, you must first reach halfway. But to reach halfway, you must reach a quarter. And before that, an eighth. Each movement requires another movement before it. So, if there are infinitely many movements between start and finish, how is motion even possible? You can't complete an infinite number of tasks, so the logic goes. So you can't ever actually arrive. And yet we do. You walk, you finish the race, you touch the wall. So, what's happening? The solution, centuries later, comes not from denying the paradox, but from reframing it through calculus. Because while there are infinitely many distances to cover, the sum of those distances converges. 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 plus. It adds up. It doesn't explode into infinity. It lands on a finite number. 1, that's the key. Zeno's paradox works by stacking infinities without limit, but mathematics shows that some infinities have boundaries, that an infinite number of steps can still lead to a finite journey. It isn't magic, it's convergence. But Zeno's paradox still matters, not because it remains unsolved, but because it shows how logic can defeat perception, and how intuition can defeat logic. It warns that movement, something we take for granted, is not simple at all, and the implications echo far beyond philosophy. They surface in physics, where space and time blur at quantum scales. In computing, where infinite loops threaten to halt progress. In decision-making, where endless microsteps lead to no action. Zeno's dichotomy isn't just about motion. It's about hesitation. It's about how infinite thinking paralyzes real movement. and how breaking things down too far can prevent us from moving forward at all. Because sometimes the answer isn't in understanding every part. It's in knowing when to step anyway. Let the paradox remind you that even infinite divisions don't prevent completion. That progress is not about eliminating every fraction of resistance. It's about trusting that steps, no matter how small, add up. Motion is not defeated by math, it is built by it. And just beyond Zeno's logic trap, another paradox steps into view. A social one this time, where the people around you seem more connected, more social, more popular, and you're left asking, why do all my friends have more friends than me? Infinite monkey theorem. Place a monkey in front of a typewriter. Let it press keys at random. Give it no instruction, no purpose, only infinite time. Now, wait. Eventually, given long enough, that monkey will type every poem, every script, every novel ever written. It will type the complete works of Shakespeare word for word, comma for comma, error for error, as well as every possible variation. This is the infinite monkey theorem, a paradox that lives at the edge of probability and time. At first, it sounds ridiculous. You picture the chaos, gibberish spilling from the machine in endless waves. Nothing readable, nothing coherent. And you're right, most of it will be nonsense. But within that noise, eventually, everything will appear. This isn't metaphor, it's mathematics. The monkey is just a stand-in for randomness, pure, directionless randomness. And given enough time, even chaos can mimic brilliance. It's a paradox not because it's false, but because it feels wrong. Because genius should come from genius. Art should come from intention, and yet the math says otherwise. Given infinite time, a finite alphabet, and enough keystrokes, the monkey will produce not just Hamlet, but every version of Hamlet ever conceived. Every line Shakespeare wrote, and every line he never dared to. It will type your name, your life story, a transcript of this very moment. All of it, eventually, by chance. The infinite monkey theorem forces a strange and uncomfortable truth, that meaning can emerge from mindlessness. That randomness, when stretched across eternity, can replicate the work of careful design. It's not that randomness creates purpose. It's that possibility expands without limit. You see echoes of this idea in nature. DNA mutates at random, and yet, over eons, it produces complexity, structure, life. Trial and error, not guided by will, but shaped by time and survival. The paradox lives in evolution, in artificial intelligence, in creativity itself, because we like to think of brilliance as rare, as sacred. But what if it's also inevitable, given enough trials? The danger in this paradox isn't in the idea of randomness, but in misunderstanding what it means. It doesn't say that randomness is efficient, or elegant, or fast. The monkey may take more time than the age of the universe to produce one readable line. And most of what it types will be noise, forever. But still, within that infinite space, every story exists. The infinite monkey theorem invites you to rethink originality, to question whether something is rare because it's hard, or because we haven't waited long enough. It challenges your sense of authorship, of order, of control. It doesn't belittle art, it elevates time. Because what we call genius may be a point on a vast landscape, one that randomness will inevitably wander into. But there's a deeper, more human layer to this paradox. It reminds us that meaning is not in the typing, meaning is in the reading. We're the ones who see the pattern, who feel the rhythm, who declare, This line matters. Without a reader, Hamlet is just ink. Without a mind, Shakespeare's work, whether typed by man or monkey, is static. The paradox doesn't erase purpose. It reveals that purpose may come after the act, not before. That even in chaos, we find ourselves reaching for meaning. Let the keys clack. Let randomness write. Not because we believe the monkey will become a poet, but because somewhere in that endless scroll of symbols is every moment we've ever lived. And just beyond the final line, another paradox rises. A quiet social truth that feels personal, where, mathematically, your friends have more friends than you do. The tolerance paradox. Tolerance is held up as a virtue, a foundation of free society, the ability to live alongside difference, to accept disagreement, to protect expression even when it offends. We build systems around it. Laws, norms, rights. We teach it in classrooms. We post it on doorways. We defend it in debate. But deep beneath this noble principle is a quiet contradiction. What happens when tolerance is extended to the intolerant? This is the tolerance paradox, first described by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, and it's one of the most dangerous and essential paradoxes in social thinking. Because here's the core conflict. If a society is tolerant without limit, tolerant even of those who are openly hostile to tolerance itself, then those intolerant voices will grow. They will exploit the freedoms they are given, and in time, they will dismantle the very system that sheltered them. Not through debate, not through persuasion, but through domination, coercion, and fear. And then tolerance dies. This isn't a theoretical risk. History is full of it. Movements that began with hateful speech, with exclusion, with supremacy, slowly rose through systems that refused to silence them, until those same movements seized control and silenced everyone else. The paradox is brutal because it pits value against survival. To preserve a tolerant society, you may be forced to refuse tolerance to those who use their voice to erase the voices of others. And now you're caught. You want to protect free speech. You want to allow disagreement. But if you allow speech whose goal is to remove that protection, you're not upholding a principle. You're digging its grave. This paradox exposes how fragile tolerance truly is. It thrives only when those within it agree, at least fundamentally, to protect the same ground, to argue without silencing, to disagree without destruction. When that agreement is broken, when tolerance is treated as weakness, the entire structure begins to collapse. But this doesn't mean we fight intolerance with censorship alone. Popper's warning wasn't about authoritarianism, it was about self-preservation. The tolerance paradox asks, can you build a space for all voices, while drawing a line against those who demand that some voices be removed? It's not about silencing disagreement. It's about recognizing when disagreement becomes dehumanization, when debate turns to incitement, when ideas shift from uncomfortable to unacceptable. A tolerant society can absorb criticism. It can handle pain, conflict, discomfort, but it cannot survive a campaign designed to make it disappear. The paradox doesn't offer easy answers. It forces you to make choices that feel wrong in order to prevent something worse. Because unchecked tolerance is not moral strength. It's surrender dressed in principle. To uphold tolerance, you must be willing to defend it, to say no, even when you'd rather say yes, to shut doors, even when your instinct is to leave them open. Let that contradiction sit in its full discomfort. The tolerance paradox does not break the ideal, it protects it. It reminds us that values, any values, must have boundaries if they are to survive. And as we close this chapter, and with it, this long winding journey through contradiction and complexity, let this be the final lesson. Every paradox we've explored, every contradiction, loop, illusion, and clash has brought us closer not to certainty, but to humility. Because the world is not built to be simple. It's not made of clean lines and easy truths. It's a place of tension, where logic meets feeling, where fairness meets failure, where movement, thought, and choice bend back on themselves. The goal was never to solve every paradox. It was to sit with them, to understand the terrain they mark, and in doing so, to rest more gently with uncertainty, not with fear, but with peace. Now, let the questions stay open. Let the thoughts drift. Let the paradoxes echo quietly, and sleep find its way in.